Good morning. We are live. We are on.
Good morning. We are 1 minute to start time. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci un peu pour temps bon matin. À présent, il est 10h, nous allons commencer. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so very much for your time this morning. Thank you for joining us at our conference focused on implementation of the St. Lucia National Language Policy. We are very grateful that we have been able to get a selection of wonderful resource persons who can, from across the Caribbean, who can give us some idea of what our considerations should be for implementing the language policy, what are some best practices that they have observed, what the research says about implementation of a policy such as this one. So we really are looking forward to hearing from them and putting together our ideas for how our national language policy for St. Lucia should be implemented. Of course, we have quite a packed schedule, as you would have noticed. I will share with you in the chat the bio of our presenters, because we may not have time to tell you about all of the great things that they have done before their presentations, and we want to stick to the time as much as possible. You will notice that our audience is muted, but we are encouraging you to put your comments and your questions in the chat. Later on in the session, after the presentations, we do have a half hour for some questions and answers and comments. So we're looking forward to hearing from you during that time. We will not spend much longer on our introductions and our hellos. Pate vini si apou wèman, même si mè mette bel had mwen pou zot pou matin, ou vini tan sa se moun nan vle di. So, nou kay komanse tout de suite, okay? Now, as I mentioned, the purpose of our session this morning is really to get an idea of what those considerations and best practices are for the implementation of the policy. I must share some apologies with you. The Honorable Minister, Sean Edward, did intend to be here. Unfortunately, there was a clash with Parliament this morning, and he does have to make some remarks there as well. And so he was unable to make it this morning. However, you may find that sometime during the session, we may have some representatives from the Department of Education who may pop in. So if they do, and they would like to make some remarks in his stead, then we will certainly entertain those. But we do have, he did want to be here and he did want that message passed on to you. Unfortunately, he was unable to do so. Before we get into the presentations, our first presenter will give us a bit of information on the sociolinguistic background of St. Lucia. Really for us to put everything in context, our presenter will be Dr. Melissa Irvine. She is a linguist by training. She has completed doctoral research on the formation of an English-based Creole in St. Lucia. After having completed her doctorate, she relocated to St. Lucia. She works with the Folk Research Center as a projects coordinator consultant. And since then, she has been keeping her ear to the ground for any and all language-related developments and opportunities. So I would like to pass you on right now to Dr. Melissa Irvine, who will give us a little idea of the sociolinguistic context in St. Lucia. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all see my screen and hear me loud and clear. Thank you. So as mentioned, I just wanted to give a really brief sort of background information on the important stuff that we need to know before moving ahead with creating any sort of plan to implement a language policy. So it's important to know who the policy is for, who the speakers are, and so on. Starting with the most official sort of data that we have, so to speak, or the most complete data for the country. There is some census data available only up until 1946, unfortunately, that shows that the number of exclusive Creole speakers, so that's monolingual speakers, has been going down. So the last recorded was 43% in 1946. You'll also note there that the number of monolingual English speakers was going down, but the number of bilingual speakers was going up. However, census data, official census data was only collected up until 1946 on language things. There was an attempt to get a language-related question onto the most recent census, but the census was postponed because of COVID, and then election kind of postpone that again, but hopefully that will be going ahead for the next period, which should be sometime soon-ish, either end of this year or next year. The next sort of source of data that we have on that is from Simmons McDonald's thesis in 1988, from some 1984 data that was collected with primary school children that showed that, judging from the sample that she had, the number of monolingual English speakers was going up as compared to 1946, but the number of monolingual Creole speakers was going down. Meanwhile, the number of bilinguals was increasing. So the figures are there, as is the source. Trying to keep this brief so we can get into the meat of today. For my own data collection, as it was mentioned, I was focusing on the English-based Creole, but I did have the opportunity to kind of move around the country a fair bit and observe from my fieldwork that was mostly in Soufrière and Beaufort, so that's towards the south of the island, mainly working with 13 to 18-year-olds, more towards the higher end of that scale, and up until 2019. From those observations, there was a wide range of different proficiencies amongst the students. Most of them were able to produce at least a couple of sentences. Some were completely fluent, others, the knowledge was mostly passive. The frequently mentioned divide between North and South in terms of proficiency and in terms of frequency of hearing the Creole were also apparent. And as a note that's kind of relevant for the language policy is that the students that I spoke to, at least, were very interested in either learning or maintaining Creole. So those who already spoke it and those who wanted to learn it were very interested in seeing it implemented in the school system. So that's promising. As was mentioned, I'm currently working with the Folk Research Center, and they are currently looking to improve or increase their educational offerings. And as part of that, we created a survey to seek some data on language usage, language attitudes, that kind of thing, to glean what the population wanted. As of right now on the survey, most of the responses are in the 20 to 49 age brackets. Respondents living in St. Lucia, primarily in the north, but we did target the diaspora as well. And the largest proportion of respondents were teachers or people working in teacher training. That's just to do with the way that the sample went out and kind of people sending it to the people they know and work with, but we're hoping to get a wider range of responses there. And that's been distributed from the start of the year, but still going on getting better and more responses there. One of the relevant questions in that was we asked what language best works in a bunch of different contexts. So the main language that the respondent group speaking at home, communicating with family and friends, speaking in informal settings, speaking in formal settings, conveying personal thoughts and emotions, and then writing in informal and formal settings. Now, I'm not going to go through these one at a time, but the thing to notice here is the real prevalence of standard English across the board. Again, this is self-reported, so interpret that as you will. The interesting thing I found was this category here, where speaking in informal settings, the non-standard English kind of surpassed both standard English and Creole there, which from what we know of the way Creoles tend to be used, it makes sense that it's really indicative of the usage of Creole at the moment. But again, this is just based on the responses that we had there. In terms of proficiency, again, self-rated, the purple bar is native. It couldn't quite fit on this chart. Most people rated their proficiency in Creole as limited working proficiency. The next category there was native as compared to non-standard English, where the majority of people said native proficiency. And then looking over at standard English here, we have professional proficiency and native proficiency being the two highest categories. For interest, again, in terms of interest, I guess, in the implementation of Creole and the language policy, we asked if respondents think it is important to teach Creole at school, and a resounding 94.8% said yes. However, this should be taken with several grains of salt, because the type of people who would be answering a survey about language attitudes and language identity are probably the ones who also would be interested in seeing Creole taught at school. And finally, I wanted to share the responses to this question, which was familiarity with the official writing system. The biggest category there, as you can see, says that no people, or the people who responded there, are not familiar with the spelling system and use their own. And the next biggest category was people who are familiar with the spelling system but use their own anyway. So that is just something to note there. 17.4% said yes and use the official spelling system. And also of note is the 15% who speak but never write in Creole. So that was just some information that I wanted to share that I figured would be relevant for today's proceedings. Thank you, and I look forward to everyone else's contributions.
Thank you so very much for that quick look at just our context in terms of language. Of course, we know that here as you can see from the presentation, we have quite a few languages working here in St. Lucia. And of course, one influences the other heavily. I think it's kind of, it's good to see that we have bilingualism on the rise, which means we don't have one language losing out necessarily, but that persons are using the languages. Just a quick, maybe a quick addition to that kind of context is, where does the language policy come in? Why do we have this policy? Most of you would have recalled that during our sensitizations, we mentioned the link between this draft policy being developed out of all of those documents presented before in St. Lucia on what should happen with the Creole language. And one of the things we've noticed in education is that our students are struggling with developing competence in the languages, even the standard English. again, because their native language was not being given the consideration that allowed them to develop full literacy in their first language, in their native language. So this policy on this end, from the perspective of the Department of Education, really focuses on ensuring that all of our children are literate in their first language, which would then help them to develop literacy in other languages, not just the standard English, but other languages as well. We do, if we can just take a quick look at some of the presenters, some of the sessions that we will have this morning, the presentations, we will be looking at from just a language policy perspective. From Professor Hubert Devenish, what are some considerations for implementing any language policy? We will also look at from Haiti, from Dr. Sprue and BNMA, what have been some of the successes, challenges, and best practices from their own experience with implementing a policy. Then we will look at from Martinique, who they're also implementing Creole instruction at the primary and secondary schools. What has that been like? What are some of the things that we need to consider as we go into ensuring that students at the primary and secondary level are learning? So what are the practical considerations on the ground as that is happening? And of course, we have the teacher education perspective. From that perspective, what do we need to consider? How will this impact teacher education, continuing professional development, and so on? We will take a 5-minute break so that you can rest your eyes and maybe stretch your limbs a bit, just for 5 minutes, after which we will look at some suggestions from Dr. Dalfinis about implementing this language policy from his perspective as well. And we will wrap up with Professor Hazel Simmons McDonald and Dame Paulette Louisi, who will share with us evidence-based approaches based on research that has been conducted in the context, what these suggestions, what the direction should be for the implementation of the policy. As mentioned previously, we will have a half-hour question and answer session where you can please pose your questions in the chat. We will pull them up and our panelists will respond to them. And we will close off with what happens next now that we have this information. What do we do next? What is the next step? Okay, so at this point, we will thank you so much again, Dr. Irvine, for that view of snapshot of the context. We will now pass our screen over to Professor Hubert Devenish. And just before he comes on, he is a professor emeritus in linguistics at the University of the West Indies. He was formerly the coordinator of the Jamaican language unit, and he has for much of his career been engaged in research and advocacy around granting official language status to Creole languages in the Caribbean. So with that in mind, please, let's give him our undivided attention.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And where I'll start though is with, before I get to the core of what I need to talk about, is that from everything that I've read on the draft policy as well as what Melissa presented, it is clear that the policy that is being proposed is really far more of a language revitalization project than a mother tongue education project, right? Or education proposal, because for the probable vast majority of children in the schools, St. Lucia English vernacular is mother tongue. And if we are proceeding on a mother tongue principle, that will be and should be the focus for the vast majority of the project, etc. But of course, we are getting the presentation of Creole as the mother tongue, but it is really the language of identity of St. Lucians. And that's something slightly different, because this program policy is really attempting to bring back Creole as the common language, native language, if you wish, of the vast majority of children, but that is not what exists. In all likelihood, at present, St. Lucia English vernacular is it. So I'm just framing that before I proceed with what really I am going to focus on. Now, the first comment I want to make is this, that what is an official language policy? And what I'm saying is that the official policy is typically some kind of document sanctioned by the state that often is in the form of legislation, and it includes standards, rules, guidelines, and so on about how language should be used. The policy typically applies to two areas of language use. The first is language use within the state, the government itself. What languages can and should be used in parliament, the courts, the organs of government, giving access to things such as health and law and order, education, and so on. And that policy typically regulates both language use in speech and in writing, with an emphasis mostly on writing. Because as you know, legislative and administrative bodies rely a lot for their functioning on records, and the records tend to be kept in writing. And therefore, the language policies pay a lot of attention to the written, what languages should be used within the structure of government, and particularly in writing. Now, the second area in which official language policy operates and tackles is the question of what language or languages the services of the state are to be provided to the public in. So you get regulations in the policy which say things like the citizens of the country can access the services of so and so and so, or they have the right to access X or Y in A and B and C language, which means that the state then now has to provide those services in those languages. And if they don't, if the state doesn't provide it, people's rights are deemed as to be violated, okay? And of course, one such service is, of course, the service of education. Now, so that is what an official language policy, a national language policy is. It regulates the operations of language in the society at large in all areas and domains controlled by the state. Now, that against that background, the draft national language policy is not a national policy, but a language education policy, which of course is part of a national official language policy, but it is not the policy itself, right? Now, in fact, there is in existence a template for official language policies that has been modified for the Caribbean. And that is in the form of the Charter on Language Rights in the Creole-speaking Caribbean, which was agreed on at a conference of over 100 linguists and experts and so on in January 2011. And attending that particular conference and signing on in their private capacities were the Governors General of Belize, Calvary-Young, and the Emperor Louis of St. Lucia. Now, the charter, hammered out by a team of about 80 linguists or so, it spells out a philosophy for language policy based on human rights and the rights of the citizen. And it covers official language policy as it relates to public administration, official bodies, the socioeconomic sphere, education in schools, education out of school, and culture. And it was produced to be considered and adopted by individual Caribbean governments as a guide to their own language policies within their particular territories. Now, where we are currently, we are in this interesting situation where the St. Lucian authorities are considering a language education policy, a national language education policy. But really, it needs to be part of a national language policy, a national official language policy. And we're saying the charter covers all of that. And that it therefore means that the people who are devising and working on the national language education policy, which is what we're discussing here, right? Could either the government could adopt the charter, which was how it was designed. It was designed for governments to sign on to it, but they tended not to, or they haven't, even though representatives, even formal representatives of governments, Trinidad and Tobago and Antigua, the Minister of Education of Antigua, attended the conference and so on. We didn't make a lot of headway in government signing on, but it exists as a framework as to work with. And that as St. Lucia attempts to sort itself out on the broader national language policy, that the charter is a good place to start. Now, just referring to the St. Lucia National Language Policy, the point is that typically language education policies are designed to support and promote the language policies and practices of the society as a whole. So what you then get is that in a context where already public records, government services, etc., you have that policy, then you say, okay, how are we going to ensure that the education system reproduces the skills necessary for people to operate in the languages deemed to be official? And that's where the school system comes in to say, hey, we're going to teach you to read and write. We're going to teach you specialist styles that are required for public formal communication in parliament or the government officials and so on, right? And then, but what we've got in the St. Lucia situation is the cart in front of the horse. In other words, we've got a drive towards language education policy, right? Outside the framework of a national language policy. But that doesn't mean you can't move, but it's simply what I'm saying is that, you know something, if you find yourself in a situation where the cart is in front of the horse, you're going to have to engineer for the horse to push the cart rather than pull it. And so that's what I'm going to be trying to talk about, the improvisation given the realities of the current situation. Now, let me come back to, again, the realities of the current situation are that you're really dealing with a language revitalization project for the vast majority of children. And talking about mother tongue and native and justifying it, that is only mother tongue education for Creole, right, is only a reality for, none of us know the exact number of children, but we certainly know it is not the majority of children in St. Lucia. So that has to be borne in mind. So for the vast majority of children, this is really learning a language that exists around their grandparents, and they hear some people talking all the time, but they don't have any active competence in it. And you're trying to now push it from passive competence into active competence as part of functioning within a society where Creole is a living, vibrant language that you can use to get ahead and so on. That is, of course, going to require the addition of a national official policy that creates the conditions for there to be a drive and a motivation for people who are passive users and almost non-users, semi-users, to develop the competence, right? Now, looking at this now, so that you now are implementing a language policy in a school population, which is very varied. Some of them have standard English as their home language. The majority have St. Lucia English vernacular as their home language, with varying levels of competence in Creole. And maybe a few of them have Creole as their native language. And you're trying to implement an interesting language policy which ignores, well, that recognizes but doesn't really promote St. Lucian English vernacular. You're implementing a policy which is going to promote, which is, this is ironic because you are not, for the vast majority of children, promoting their native language. Because at the end, all of the objectives in the draft policy talk about the fact that the children should come out from primary school competent and literate in the two languages, and then at the end of secondary school having a high level of functional abilities and so on in both languages. But basically, you are having them, in fact, develop competencies in two second languages, whereas, and at the same time, the question really is, what is the role of this in-between one? Well, we know the policy mentions that it's there to be referred to and used to some extent, but it doesn't receive any focus beyond being a means to an end, a means to learning English, a means to distinguishing between English and it. And of course, at the same time, we want the Creole. So we've got the two languages with the in-between one, which has the majority of speakers, right, left somewhere in a kind of never-never land. But again, the point is that we have to work with what we have. You're not living in a perfect world. So that one of the big problems then for implementation is going to be teachers, because your teachers are not competent in Creole. Right. Two, or are unlikely to be competent in Creole to the levels required. In general, there will be exceptions to the rule. But if what we are hearing and seeing and imagine is there, then there's going to be limited competence among the teachers. So the teacher training is going to have to require several things. Both the use of both language competence, Creole language competence, spoken, the use of Creole for the ones who already speak it. It's encouraging the use in a formal situation, and as well developing the kinds of terminology that are going to be required to teach mathematics and so on. I know a lot of people talk Creole, but when they count in English, right? So all of that. And then, of course, sometimes overcoming the embarrassment of using Creole in a formal situation in a classroom. So there's a whole lot of personal stuff that people are going to have to overcome. Now, in rolling out this, as I say, I keep saying, we're operating in an imperfect situation. Dash out the textbook. We're just doing what is possible in the circumstances. So none of this is textbook, right? But that said, we're operating in a worse situation with the restraints and constraints of the COVID-19 epidemic and so on. Now, what we need to really be looking at though is how you roll out a program. There's a standard technique for rolling out language education projects the world over, at least in third world countries. Tanzania back in 1964, more recently in Aruba and Curacao. It's the year-by-year approach, right? You simply, in the case of Curacao, they were introducing it right through the 14 or 15 years of education. And they simply started at the beginning, at the lowest level. They have a preliminary year, and then you implement. And this is the kind of model that I would be suggesting that gets used. That this coming year, which is this year that we're in now, 2021 to 22, becomes preliminary year for the first year of primary school, preliminary preparation. This is teacher preparation, right? Textbook support material and that kind of thing. Public education, and even parent education, because it would be helpful for as many parents as possible to acquire and learn literacy in Creole, because it's going to help both the attitudes of the children, attitudes of the parents, and the fact that the parents would then be able to support literacy in Creole amongst the children in the activity, right, in the program, right? We're talking, so teachers have to be trained to use the language in public formal situations for the technical subjects, the counting, the maths, and so on, right? They've got to be trained to write, and they have also got to learn to manage their own hang-ups, their own linguistic hang-ups. What I will now do is kind of just say a little bit. So basically what I'm saying is rollout strategy, preliminary year this year, and then you roll into the implementation year, first year, next year for the lowest level of primary. In that year, you are initiating your preparations for implementation at level 2 of primary, and you keep going up so that by the end of 7 years, you've fully implemented the program. And you've had in each case, you build in a preliminary year to train teachers at that level, at the coming level, and prepare materials for the coming level. And then you have the implementation year. And in the project implementation process, both years should involve the teachers operating as a group. Based on our own experience of implementing a bilingual education project, we feel that you need to trust the teachers. Nobody can dictate to a teacher in the classroom what they must do. Try to get training groups of maybe 15 people or so across schools, because you'd be doing, say, a particular grade. And so if there are 3 schools with, say, 3 or 4 or 5 teachers at a particular grade level, you pull them together as a group and they work, right? That peer group observation is helpful. We found that, where they visited each other's classrooms, looked at videos of each other teaching and so on. They worked on teaching materials that they found were particularly necessary to teach particular concepts and so on. So they produced their own teaching materials, which could now be fed into the project itself. And that was happening while they were teaching the program. So I've given you an implementation process of two year, going up. The idea that the teachers are grouped together as a cohort where they work with each other to do stuff, right? And to implement the program. Because what we're stressing and what our experience stresses is that teachers need to have a vested interest in the success of the program, and they have to be incentivized. In our case, we thought and think that some kind of formal academic qualification that will contribute to a degree or a diploma in bilingual education is the way to go, because it then translates into both higher status for the teacher as well as some more money, right? We found that the donkey work of textbook translation and materials could actually be done by tertiary level students under supervision in the holiday period before the implementation of the program. And I've already mentioned targeting the parents and so on. So essentially, you have a less than perfect situation, but with all of that, if the teachers have the will and if the community has the will to really engage in this, which is essentially, as I'm stressing, a language revitalization project for the vast majority of children, then they can make it work. But there is still, and I kind of will conclude with this, the program project policy has a huge gaping hole in that it sees St. Lucia English vernacular, which is the language of the vast majority of children in the school system, as either a stepping stone to English or as a barrier to English. Oh, we have to teach them the difference between St. Lucia English vernacular and English so they can get good English. Right? It has no other, or seems in the policy to have no other role than to facilitate the learning of the other languages. Yet it is the mother tongue, and we are operating or pretending to operate on the principle that we want mother tongue education. So in conclusion, I'm saying messy situation, you have to do what you have to do, but in the process, we have also to deal with these internal contradictions and the fact that language revitalization is actually being presented as if it is mother tongue education. Sorry for being so controversial, but that's it. Thanks.
Professor Devonish, thank you very much for those thoughts that you have shared. The purpose of our meeting here together is actually to pay attention to those considerations, pay attention to those ideas. So certainly it would be remiss of us to consider what may be some controversial ideas or even opposing ideas. And you did make some distinctions between what a national language policy would be and what counts as an educational language policy. Of course, we also made note of the reference to our Creole English and the role that it should be playing, as well as the considerations that you mentioned, such as teacher training. Of course, I will not be responding to any of those comments. What we will do is continue to take in information from the other experts that we have on our panel. And at the end of this process, see how we can put all of that together to make the decisions that we would need to make as a Ministry of Education and as a government of St. Lucia as well. With that in mind, I will turn you over to our next presenters who are from Haiti. And we want to welcome Dr. Prue and Dr. Bien-Aimé. Dr. Prue serves as a senior researcher at Université Quisqueya in Haiti. He was the director of the Haitian Creole Institute, a co-founder and director of the Haitian Studies Association, and he has spearheaded the development of a Haitian Creole language curriculum. Dr. Bien-Aimé is currently the coordinator for innovation at Université Quisqueya, and prior to that, she served as the coordinator of Laku Kaju, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a children's educational media. She does have a PhD in language sciences, and she has written as has Dr. Prue, several articles on Creole linguistics and contrastive analysis. Again, we will share this bio with you so that you can get a little more information on our presenters. But in the interest of time, I will now pass you over to our colleagues in Haiti.
Hey, good morning, everyone, brothers and sisters from the Caribbean. Today, I'm joined with my colleagues, Dr. Bien-Aimé, for a joint presentation. And hopefully, the technology will not discourage us from doing so and will not give up on us. The width band is somewhat low, and we will try to see if we can do a shared screen, if it's possible. Dr. Bien-Aimé, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Dr. Bien-Aimé is still muted.
She's on mute. You have to unmute her.
Okay, we will ensure that she is a co-host so that she can mute and unmute.
She's still muted.
She's fine now.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Bien-Aimé, can you share the screen with the PowerPoint?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark.
Vas-y, donc.
Dr. Bien-Aimé, we are not hearing you. I am seeing your mic moving. So you are speaking, but we are not hearing you. Ms. Tagling?
Yes, thank you very much for your patience, everyone. I know that our colleagues in Haiti will have to struggle with a few bandwidth issues. So let's see if we can give them a moment. They may most likely not be able to share their videos, but hopefully turning them off will increase the bandwidth so that they can share their thoughts with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, Dr. Prue.
Okay, so basically what we're going to try to do is to look at these 3 points. It'll be a brief assessment of the linguistic situation in Haiti, and looking at the 1979 educational reform, the strength, weaknesses, challenges, and also lessons to be learned from this experience for St. Lucia. And in your conclusion, we'll make some final remark. So again, the topic that Dr. Bien-Aimé and I are covering today is implementing Creole language instruction, successes, challenges, and best practices in Haiti. I already shared with you somewhat the plan. Now, for most of you in the Caribbean, you know the size of Haiti, 27,000 kilometers with 10 departments. The areas around in the map are the areas that, Innovate works in terms of professional development and research. And by the way, Innovate is an institute for research, innovation, and teacher training at University of Quisqueya. In University of Quisqueya is a non-public university with 3 decades of operation, and also work with a number of other universities in the Caribbean, among them UWI, the member of, the COPICA, which is the Conference of Rectors of Caribbean Universities, work with universities in Cuba and several universities in North America, in Canada and Europe. And as you can see on the map, many of you have heard about the devastation which happens in the Grandin section here, which you have 3 departments: the South, the NIP, and the Grandins, where about close to 266 schools were destroyed by the earthquake. And there have been a number of support from Caribbean brothers and sisters in terms of helping us to recover from this last event. Now, the assessment, we can say basically, as you know, Haiti has the largest number of French-based Creolophone in the world. In other words, with 11 million plus speakers in Haiti, considered to be the largest space where Creole, French-based Creole is spoken. But however, even after more than 200 years of independence, Creole is still struggling to be considered at a fair value by all Haitians. And the circle you see below show you that Creole is spoken by the entire population. But inside that population, you have a small number of people who basically are bilingual. They speak both Creole and French. So the majority of the people are Creole speakers. Now, another aspect of the assessment of the linguistic situation that Dr. Bien-Aimé and I have done research on is to look first on one side, looking at first, Creole is spoken by the whole population, as mentioned earlier. And also, officially, Creole was introduced to the school only in 1979, when the country has been independent since 1804. Third, there is sort of a minoritized space from a social point of view, even today. In other words, Creole still occupies sort of a minoritized space. That is not to say that Creole is not spoken. Creole is spoken daily in all activities, in the media, social media, radio, television, but in fact, still occupy that space if we do an assessment. However, French, on the other hand, is spoken by a small portion of the population. It's difficult to put a number. Some researchers talk about 10%, some others talk about 5%, but I think it's a small portion. But also the rest of the population that is basically monolingual can understand some basic French if they've gone to school. And also for school population, they've been exposed to French. As you can see, number 3 in terms of the assessment, French is considered sometimes to be the only language of instruction, but nowadays it is one of the main language of instruction. However, it's widely used. And fourthly, in terms of the assessment, French is considered to be a vector of social mobility. In other words, people look at French as a way to socially move within the society. Next, again, in terms of the contact of French and Creole in teaching. For one, we have the Haitian school system was from its origin modeled on the French system because Haiti was colonized by French, unlike other part of the Caribbean that were colonized by British and Spanish, but Haiti was mostly colonized by French, which in fact we model our education right after independence on the French system. There was an attempt by earlier independent leaders to look toward the British system, but French overall gained the majority. Second, teaching was always conducted in the French language from the inception of the school and education of schooling in Haiti. Thirdly, the introduction of Creole only happened in 1979 with the reform of a minister called Joseph Bernard. It is normally referred as the Reform Bernard. Now, what are some of the current issues? Dr. Bien-Aimé and I have been able to look at some of them. At a glance, we can bring out those 6 elements. There are 2 official languages. Since 1987, from the Constitution, French and Creole occupy the same official space. There are also some divergent and unequal relations in terms of the use of the 2 languages. And of course, you have a large population that is monolingual. And also you have notion of linguistic insecurity. We can elaborate on that later. And also there is an impact on education and on teaching and learning in terms of using French and or Creole. And lastly, there is an issue of linguistic ambivalence because you also have the influence of English by the large diasporic communities living in North America, and of course with the number of Haitians living in Spanish-speaking countries. Of course, our neighbor, the Dominican Republic, and nowadays throughout Latin America, where you find large population of migrant Haitians. So you have ambivalence, sort of that linguistic ambivalence that seems to exist. Now, the reform Bernard, what we can say briefly about it is that in 1979, there was a major reform. There are two elements in that reform. First, the Haitian school system, as we said, was modeled from the French system. Then Bernard introduced elements to introduce Creole. Second, teaching was always given in the French language. With the reform Bernard, that has changed, where Creole occupies space. And of course, the introduction of Creole by Bernard, and also a sort of a refoundation of the educational system itself. Now, what are some of the strengths of the Bernard reform? As we said, in addition to the establishment of the primary schools, the introduction of Creole to the schools was one of the main innovations of the Bernard reform. And the reform set out strategies aimed at countering the elitism that had hitherto characterized the school system. It introduced Creole, the mother tongue spoken by all Haitians, without distinction within the school, with a view of reducing school failure and making it easier to learn. And of course, to gain access to knowledge. Another strength, as we said, that the reform did not provide for a ban on French as the language of instruction. French continues to be the language taught and the language of instruction. But with regard to the linguistic aspect of education, the general objective is therefore that of functional bilingualism, which should be achieved in the second cycle of basic education. In other words, Creole was used within the first 3 years, while French oral was used with the hope that there will be a transition, at the third level where children would move into French. That perhaps one of the strengths, but also some of the aspects that has been criticized heavily by researchers instead of looking at the native language simply as a stepping stone. Now, there were some diversions between speakers, as we point out. There were opposition to such a measure, and the opposition was expressed to varying degrees, according to the categories of the population. People from disadvantaged classes for whom French is a tool for social mobility, they want their children to quickly access the knowledge in French. As a result, the idea of subjecting them to an apprenticeship in school, as advocated by the reform, did not charm them. However, the illiterate population of the peasantry or the urban sub-proletariat accept from the outset, as soon as it has understood that it is not a question of forbidding their children to speak French and to rise into the social ladder. Vernet spoke about that lengthily in many of his work. On the other hand, parents who had been in school saw this initiative a kind of social and even intellectual regression for the children. For the well-to-do families, in other words, they saw the introduction of Creole as a setback. Now, for the peasant and people from low classes, they embraced it, but they were also very ambivalent because for them, they said, look, children of well-to-do families already know French. Now you are putting my kids will not have a chance to ever learn French. And some of them were somewhat resistant to it. But with a lot of awareness, they became to understand that the mother tongue is the best way to gain access to knowledge. And they understood also the mastery of French is not general education, because for years, they have the colonial mindset that speaking French beautifully is being knowledgeable. When they understood clearly, kids do not go to school to just learn a language. They go to school to learn science, math, and in other subjects. But through the language and the use of the language they understood better, they can get access to this knowledge. So that was somewhat difficult for them to accept, but in the end, they became familiar with it and understood it. Now, some of the weak points of the Bernard reform we can point out is that, as we said, that was one of the most important reforms that was proposed for the renewal of education in Haiti. The objectives and arguments presented by the reformers were, for the most part, commendable, if not well-founded. However, strategies for implementing the reform have not been fully successful or have not been followed up. Minister Bernard, who had at the time laid the foundation for this reform, he was dismissed from his post a couple of years later. So that's one of the things that we found. As the reform was getting traction, Bernard was let go as Minister of Education, being replaced so they could basically go back to the old system. Now, it's important to look at the issue of contact of French and Creole in teaching, because most of the time, in fact, you find Haitian teachers in schools trying to use both at the same time, or perhaps, it creates some confusion in the mind of children who do not master one of them. That's what we call the phenomenon of a dual vision. On the one hand, education actors, in particular teachers, recognize that the path toward the appropriation of knowledge is better and can be better used by the mother tongue, Creole. On the other hand, the fear that the prestigious language, French, would not be mastered at school caused a rejection of Creole. So teachers are torn between using Creole, knowing that it will do the trick in terms of getting knowledge, but also at the same time pressured by some parents not to use Creole and seeing that by not using French, they will sacrifice the stepping stone that many parents strive for. Now, what are some of the challenges? Dr. Bien-Aimé and I will look at the challenges in terms of, first of all, there's a need for a more stable political climate that would allow for continuity in such projects. Because within the span of 2 decades, you had more than 22 or 25 ministers of education. Some ministers will not last 3 or 4 months in the post. So there is political instability. Therefore, there cannot be continuity in any actions or plans put by a minister. The second is that the training of teachers, and when we talk about training of teachers, intense training of teachers so that they are able to teach in a bilingual context, which is a great challenge. For the most part, many teachers are ill-prepared, they do not master French, and they are expected to teach French. So that has been a problem. And thirdly, we think that the design of didactic materials in Creole for all subjects remains the biggest challenge, because many of the publishers who have big contracts with the ministers, they continue to publish books in French, and of course, at the dismay of recommendation by the ministry. Now, what are some thoughts and action we propose for St. Lucia? We think when you embark in this, you have to have a massive awareness raising campaign. So to get people to understand the foundation of such a measure. We also think that collaborative action research between OECS and Haiti and other Creole-speaking countries, whether Martinique, Guadeloupe, would be helpful. We also think that we should encourage the emergence of a didactic field, specific training for teachers and school personnel, production of didactic materials are some of the things that are important. Mother tongue teaching and learning task force, I think, would be important to have a research and development framework, co-create curriculum with partners, and also public regional universities support, could be an effort to do that, which is in a model of a hub and spoke model, technical capacity building for schools of education. And finally, we think for future activities, there should be expanded relationship with other Creole-speaking countries to increase network exchange and production of high-quality didactic materials, integrate Creole-speaking countries at regional level, and such gathering as you're having right now, collaborate with them to create strategies for education. And we also think if you create a St. Lucia national think tank, where you can begin to kickstart a national research and data center to look at the progress you're making and to monitor, because we believe that research and action, research should be at the prime in terms of understanding what's happening to be guiding. With that, we want to thank you. Merci en pile, and we'll be open for question and conversation later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our colleagues from Haiti, Dr. Prue. That was a very interesting presentation that you made there to us. And there are some of the things that I noticed that maybe even shared challenges, especially in terms of continuity for implementation. that this should not be something that is tied to one person or to one group. It really should be a shared priority so that continuity is ensured. Again, the idea of, or the issue of teacher training is brought up, and the concern over competence and mastery of the languages for instruction and the design of materials as well. And finally, one of the points that I really wanted to latch on to was your point about research and the role that research really plays in this process. And it's something that will start off the process, that will continue the process as we go along with implementation. And of course, we will find out that quite a bit of research has been done in the solution context, and we will see how that will inform the implementation plan that we will design. Please, to our attendees, we will have the question and answer session a little later on. So based on the presentation that we've had from Haiti, please post your questions in the chat so that later on, Drs. Prue and BNMA would be able to respond to those. So if you have questions about any of their successes, their challenges and how they overcame them, or whether they were able to, please post those in the chat so that we can ask them and get them answered a little later on. Thank you again so much, Drs. Prue and BNMA. We really appreciate the effort that you've made today in spite of the low bandwidth. We really benefited from your presentation and from the ideas and suggestions that you have shared with us. At this point, we're going to move on to another one of our colleagues from Martinique. We will be listening to Mr. Rene Mutama and some of his colleagues, and they will be presenting on what implementation or instruction at the classroom level looks like. We will allow them to give us a little background on who they are and what are some considerations we need to have as we're looking at implementing at the classroom level. On to you, Dr. Prue. We may have to ask you to end your sharing so that our colleagues in Martinique can share their screen if they need to. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. J'espère tout le monde est bien. Je vais commencer par féliciter les premiers gens qui parlaient parce que tu as des belles paroles. Je vais féliciter M. Marpou, puisque mon recueil, j'ai pensé, bazot, tout ça qui est formation, tout ça qui est livre pour ça former les enseignants et puis les élèves là. Et il parlait aussi de recherche et d'un bagage pour évaluer, pour dire ça nous a fait et ça nous a fait. Donc, bel passage, M. Marpou. Donc, pour ça, nous avons présenté pour Martinique. Donc, nous essayons de faire une petite présentation pour montrer les autres ça nous a fait. Donc, pour commencer, je vais esquisser des gens qui parlent là, des chefs là, chef premier degré, primary, et chef second degré, secondary, qui pas là parce qu'il y a d'autres réunions. Donc, multi-présentation nous teni mon Lupon qui peut pas être là et puis mon Pietrus qui c'est les deux chefs la Martinique qui a géré Creole là. Donc c'est moi qui a fait présentation au bas de jeudi. Donc pour jeudi nous prévoyons un petit programme pour dire autres ça comment on est balayé au niveau 4 là qui ça y autorisé nous faire comment on est nous qu'a fait un pays et puis nous parler aussi de ça monsieur Marc pour parler italien dit formation qui ça nous a les professeurs pour commencer à travailler sur cette chambre là et après pour perspective et questions diverses là point 4 là puis point 5 là nous qui virer ça après les nous qui fait questions diverses nous qui parler tout le monde ensemble donc nous qui fait un bref historique très rapide de ça qui fait Martinique pour nous arriver jeudi jour les textes là qui existaient jeudi jour politique au niveau national français et politique au niveau Martinique même donc depuis 1960, nous avons essayé de travailler avec ça, mais Creole là pour autoriser l'école. Je remercie en même temps mon Saint-Saul qui fait les traductions bah, nous, pour que ça comprendre ça, nous télémontrer autres là. Donc, qu'on nous dit aller à signer un monde qui pas comprendre, il a écrit dans le chat là pour nous faire faire une petite traduction. Donc, à partir de 1970, il a commencé à faire le programme l'école. À partir de 1983, Creole a rentré l'école, effectivement, par rapport au recteur. Et là, il a commencé à créer, à partir de 1987, des mouns qui étaient là pour les professeurs dans la classe, et puis ça, aider eux, mettre des bagages en créole en place, que ce soit au niveau culture là, que ce soit au niveau langue là. Après, ils ont commencé à mettre un nom particulier, tout à fait LCR, c'était langue et culture régionale. Et là, ils ont commencé à mettre dans formation les professeurs au départ. Là, ils ont commencé à venir professeurs. Ils ont déjà mis en formation là, ça depuis 1989. Et en 1992, ils ont créé ça, ils ont créé les CPD-LVR. C'est des formateurs, c'est des gens combrés, des gens qui font formation, qui peuvent aller qui peuvent former des gens pour faire créole l'école. Et axe formation, c'est lui qui est important. Il est important parce que il faut nous former les gens avant de commencer le travail. Donc, ensuite, nous commençons à faire CAPES créole, ça veut dire pour secondary, pour tous les gens qui ont second degré, pour que eux aussi, ils puissent ni des gens diplômés. Donc, souvent, c'est des gens qui ni en double bagaille, ils ont fait français et créole, ils ont fait anglais et créole, ils ont fait plusieurs. Et donc, ensuite, en 2004, ils ont créé en mission pour créole là. Et puis, plusieurs gens, je vais expliquer les autres après comment il y a la fête. Ensuite, ils ont commencé à faire, depuis 2007, des textes, des manières faits, des contenus, des manières faits pour savoir qui sont quoi faire Pichomé là et puis à quel niveau quoi faire Pichomé là. Partie très important parce que ça permet de les professeurs en manière fait. Donc, après, ils ont renforcé mission LV au premier degré, donc primary, pour nous faire ça travail mieux en laisse ça. Donc, après 2010-2011, là, c'est là qu'il y a un programme qui sortit. Et puis, ça, il a créé la démarche contrastive, comme on explique les autres après. C'est un manière fait où nous ne pouvons pas comparer seulement les langues là, nous pouvons essayer d'aller plus loin, où chaque mot qui ça il est dit et qui s'enseigne dans les autres langues là, et ça permet cette chambre-là après d'y apprendre d'autres langues. Parce que là où ça permet de comparer des langues, là où j'en ai des langues là, petit, là qui a venu plus grand, il peut apprendre d'autres langues, il peut apprendre espagnol, il peut apprendre anglais, il peut apprendre plusieurs d'autres langues par rapport à Martinique. Donc, depuis 2017, nous avons des classes bilingues, des classes où c'est moitié temps français, moitié temps créole. Ça prend temps pour mettre les en place, mais nous l'avons gourmé. Nous avons déjà 5 classes bilingues. Actuellement, nous avons presque 20 classes bilingues dans l'état là. Nous l'avons battu ça. Et depuis 2020, nous l'avons fait un lignage premier, second degré, primary, second degré ensemble pour que nous puissions travailler ensemble. Et là, le gouvernement finit faire un rapport pour dire qui ça a fait en langue régionale en toute France, qui ce soit pour créole, que ce soit pour les autres langues régionales là, en France, pour savoir qui ça qui a mis en place et comment les créole là, lui aussi, qui ça qui a fait pour eux. Donc, nous avons le programme qui j'ai fait pour expliquer comment on fait créole l'école Martinique. Donc, nous pouvons laisser ça là, parce que nous avons un parti politique. Parce qu'il faut que le gouvernement décide que nous pouvons faire. Par exemple, Martinique, créole en option, il n'est pas obligatoire. Ça veut dire que si professeurs allaient y faire, et il faut que tous les parents d'accord pour que nous créons l'école. Nous devons préférer obligatoire pour que toutes les chambres rentrent en dîner. Donc, il y a des programmes qui fait. Il y a créé le cadre européen. Le cadre européen commun des langues, CECRL, ça veut dire dans toute l'Europe, il y a un dossier fait et dossier a dit comment il y a apprendre en langue et il y a différents niveaux et à dans bagaïta par exemple là il y a pas dit écouter, garder puis comprendre et donc il y a différents niveaux à dans écouter, garder puis comprendre et nous appuyer en ces textes là pour nous faire ça apprendre à l'école en fonction de ça ça fait si il a comprendre l'anglais ou s'il a parler. Si il comprend l'anglais, eh bien, il n'a pas parler, ou s'il n'a pas comprendre, eh bien, il n'a pas parler. Et en fonction de l'action, nous avons avancé par rapport à la programmation. Donc, Politique académique là, c'est un bail qui est simple parce que la politique nationale, c'était pour développer l'anglais. Donc, il finit faire un rapport, il fait un diagnostic pour savoir qui ça qui a fait. Et politique académique là, justement, c'est l'INH là, c'est joindre primary and secondary, premier degré puis second degré pour que nous puissions travailler ensemble. Donc, pour Creole premier degré, primary, nous n'y en structure, nous n'y en monde en chef, nous n'y en conseiller, en formateur, et nous n'y 10 monde qui travaillent. Matinique découpé en 10 morceaux, et dans chaque morceau matinique, il y a un monde qui est là pour aller voir tous les professeurs, pour aller ça qui ça fait créole, pour aller bailler un coup de main, et ça qui pourquoi qu'a fait créole, pour garder si vous motivé, si vous intéressé, pour que ça passer habilitation, parce que nous n'y en habilitation pour nous n'y en certificat ou peut dire que vous pouvez faire créole l'école. Si vous n'avez pas de certificat, vous ne pouvez pas faire créole l'école. Vous pouvez faire en partie culturelle, vous pouvez faire un débat en créole, mais normalement, ou pas ni les outils et grâce à la formation, nous avons des outils pour que vous puissiez débrouiller quoi pour bien comprendre comment on a utilisé l'anglais, comment on a comparé les langues pour que vous puissiez débrouiller quoi. Donc, nous avons 10 personnes qui travaillent en l'intérieur pour ça. Donc, nous comment on a matinique découpé en morceaux pour ça, pour chaque monde en un secteur, chaque monde en un côté pour y peut aller et puis où les professeurs aller aider eux pour y peut ça faire créole l'école. Donc, mi comment pays a million de chiffres pays a nombre l'école qui a fait créole, nombre classe qui a fait créole et ma carrément des autres regarder dernière ligne là, c'est nombre professeurs qui a fait l'école. Nous avons 742 professeurs qui a fait créole l'école. Et chaque année, nous avons fait entre 30 et 50 personnes en plus qui a fait créole l'école. Ça veut dire qu'ils ont passé certification, ils ont passé devant moi et moi validé que ils peuvent faire créole l'école, ils ont ça qu'il faut pour que ça bien faire les choses à comprendre la différence entre les deux langues et puis ils peuvent ça justement améliorer ça, les compétences. Ça veut dire que si vous apprenez à comparer ces deux langues, après, vous pouvez comparer d'autres langues et apprendre d'autres langues. Puisque nous, à Dubaï, il faut, c'était bien que vous appreniez plusieurs langues. C'est ça le but là. Donc, nous avons que dernière ligne là, qu'il y a 24%, 25% de donc en quart les chamaï matinique qui a fait créole l'école au quotidien pour l'État. Donc, pour secondary, pour second degré, ni aussi en structure, ni en monde qui chef, mon Pietrus Catherine, et puis ni deux chargés de mission, des monde qui sont en pays pour aider les collègues là et faire formation, et ni un chargé numérique. C'est pour tout ça qui est informatique, tout ça qui est numérique, pour bon coup de main, pour que ça mette au niveau numérique. C'est un bail qui est important. Donc, dans le secondaire, il y a ni collégien, Timomai qui est entre 11 ans et puis 15-16 ans, c'est ni 1948 Timomai qui a fait créole. Et pour les plus grands, pour ça qui est au lycée, ça veut dire entre 16-17 ans jusqu'à 20 ans, voire 22 ans, ni 521 Timomai qui a fait créole l'école, dans les plus grands. Donc, nous ni 34 enseignants en secondaire, dans le second degré qui a fait créole l'école. Nous avons des gens qui sont certifiés, ça veut dire que c'est des gens qui sont en haut niveau en créole. Et puis, nous avons des gens qui sont stagiaires, qui apprennent. Nous avons des gens qui sont habilités. Ça veut dire qu'ils sont habilités pour faire créole l'école. Ils sont là aussi. Et puis, ni contractuels. Des gens qui n'ont pas de diplôme là, mais qui montrent nous qu'après un échange parole, qu'ils ont fait créole l'école et qu'ils ont accepté qu'ils allaient devant Timomai. Donc, là, nous avons combien d'élèves en tout qui a fait créole l'école depuis la 6e, donc depuis 11 ans, 12 ans, 13 ans, 14 ans, pour juste arriver en terminale, arriver à 18 ans, non petit moment qui a fait créole l'école pour secondaire, pour second degré. Donc, nous faisons des classes bilingues, donc c'est ça, je dit tout à l'heure, donc nous les renforcer, ça y a créé la compétence varilingue. Ça veut dire, vous faites chemin là, pour ça, manière y pour ça, montrer comment il peut mélanger les deux langues et que ça utiliser ces deux langues comme il faut. Les qui parlent créole, qui jouent puis langue les qui parlent créole, les qui parlent français, qui savent qui c'est qui utilise français et qui même comprendre sens les mots encore mieux pour qu'ils puissent ça débrouiller correctement. Donc, nous avons appuyé en l'environnement proche de là, ça qui est à côté, Parce que il faut nous partir d'ici qui est à côté pour y apprendre lire ça qui est à côté, apprendre comprendre ça qui est à côté, apprendre où les pieds bois qui bokaili, les fleurs qui bokaili, les manger qui manger bokaili, comment y a préparer ces bêta parce que ça fait partie de vie, ça fait partie de ça qui vivre au quotidien. Donc partie d'environnemental mais aussi partie artistique là, partie sport là, partie géographie, histoire. Ça veut dire que tout ça qui est alentour qu'ils comprennent qu'ils n'y racine, c'est ça nous a dit, qu'ils savent côté et ils savent côté qu'ils peuvent aller. Donc, nous avons aussi valorisé toutes ces pratiques au niveau créole là, mais nous les moderniser comme nous les mettre comme nous au niveau numérique. Donc, nous avons valorisé, nous avons aidé les gens qui les font là, en les numériques là aussi, en l'internet là aussi. Donc, quand on compte ça, Chomala a parlé, c'est un bagage qui permet de Chomala améliorer, puisque nous avons partir de ça, ils savent. Et à partir de ça, ils savent, nous avons montré comment c'est peut devenir meilleur. Et c'est là. Et ça a évité que des chamaïs qui ont des difficultés à l'école, qui, par exemple, qui bokaili, qui ni plus créole, qui peut-être anglais ou français, ces chamaïs permettent d'avancer. Mon travail pendant longtemps, et puis en l'autre chamaïs qui partait sali, mais des petits chamaïs qui étaient venus de Saint-Lucie, des petits chamaïs qui étaient venus de Dominique, des petits chamaïs qui étaient venus d'Haïti. Parce que moi, j'ai travaillé au côté, moi, j'ai choisi de travailler avec des chamaïs qui étaient en difficulté, des chamaïs qui étaient pas arrivés. Et en fait, moi, j'ai passé aussi par langue créole. Langue créole, c'était en manière faire le pont, faire le lien entre français et puis anglais. C'était lui qui était capable maintenant faire le chemin là, rentrer dans l'école là. Et c'est là que créole là est demandé en l'eau, là, parce que ça permet de revenir dans l'école, recommencer à apprendre l'école. Donc, il faut nous voir que nous pas faire créole pour créole, nous pas faire créole là pour chama là, savent côté qui mounier, mais nous l'est aussi que ça permet lui aussi avancer en les routes travail pour qu'il vienne encore meilleur l'école là. Donc nous avons parlé du plurilingue, ça fait apprendre plusieurs langues et grâce à le fait que nous faisons là réfléchir les langues, il y a créé ça le métalinguistique, le métalinguisme. Nous apprenons à faire réfléchir les langues, réfléchir les deux langues, et là, on peut apprendre à réfléchir les plusieurs langues ou qu'on peut réfléchir les d'autres langues. Donc, si déjà, on a réfléchi comment est français, comment est créole, comment est imbriqué, comment est peut gérer, il y en a pilote, là, on arrive en l'espagnol, l'espagnol, là, on arrive en l'anglais, ou que ça rentre en idée, puis analyser, essayer de comprendre. Et ça qui permet de là, faire développer nos compétences pour parler, pour dire ça y est, pour dire ça y a senti, et peut-être pour faire bagaille dans la vie. Donc, même manière nous répartis, nous avons 109 élèves et puis 6 professeurs qui ont fait classe bilingue, donc moitié français, moitié créole, matinique. Donc, pour l'instant, nous avons ça, mais l'en état, nous connaissons bien plus. Mais bah, là, organisé, ça veut dire que nous avons en organisation au niveau les chefs là, au niveau les formateurs, au niveau les. Parce que matinique découpe en 10 parties, chaque partie a un chef, mais aussi au niveau des directeurs de l'école là, et nous n'y avons pour nous suivre les moulins. Ça veut dire que nous avons suivi au quotidien pour nous aller régulièrement, et puis nous n'y avons suivi universitaire. Ça, c'est pour d'Italia, c'est le fait que nous n'avons pas universitaire pour nous aller plus loin dans l'analyse là, nous avons faire. Donc, nous avons régulièrement, nous avons des moments de formation, des moments séminaires, et puis nous avons des créations d'outils pour nous créer des outils et puis pour que vous ne pas senti que vous tout seul dans l'intérieur, qu'à créer des bagages tout seul dans le coin. Donc, actuellement, nous passons dans la deuxième partie à ma réponse qui est intéressante. Puis ça, nous avons fait exactement. Donc, ni évolution des pratiques. Maintenant, dans le monde bon matin, qui était parlé, dit comment est la TI avant et comment est la venir aujourd'hui jour. Donc, Martinique aussi, moun pateni doit parler créole parce que je t'ai dit que créole là, t'es capable pour nous parler français. Et en fait, je dis jour, nous que nous pouvons faire l'aider sans yon faire l'autre la mal. Donc, il faut nous continuer à dans ce sens-là parce que yon peut nourrir l'autre. Parce que nous avons des créoles à base lexicale française. Ça veut dire que c'est français, d'ini longtemps, français de 1700, c'est français que vous vivez, vous mélangez puis les langues africaines, les langues indiennes, toutes les mots, les langues, les indiens qui étaient là, les amérindiens, et ça fait une langue qui fait créole là. Donc, dans l'évolution des pratiques là, nous voyons que de plus en plus de professeurs car ouais importance d'y faire créole l'école parce que yo ka ouais que yo ni des petits moments les chama la ka parler les chama la ka mélanger les deux langues là et pour pas mélanger les deux langues là il faut que apprendre chama la bien ouais ça qui en langue ça qui l'autre et puis côté mélange là qu'a fait pour pas ni à mélanger il a écrit parce que les qui écrit, qui besoin être performant dans les deux langues. Si on vient écrit en créole, que ça bien écrit en créole, si on vient écrit en français, que ça bien écrit en français. Donc, c'est ça nous qu'a cherché faire. Donc, dans la stratégie, il y a trois grands bagailles. Tout ça qui est langageur, manière parler, tout ça qui est culture et puis lexique, ça veut dire vocabulaire, et puis tout ça qui est linguistique, analyse langue. Comment nous analyser langue. Donc, par rapport à ça, pour activité langageur, manière parler, ni plusieurs bagailles. C'est les programmes qui cabent nous ça. Écouter, comprendre, lire, comprendre, parler et puis parler tranquillement, concis, que vous pouvez parler sans freiner, écrit, apprendre, écouter et puis réagir. Ça veut dire, écouter un monde et pourquoi dire qu'on peut répondre nous et moi qui peux dire ça m'a pensé. Ça veut dire comment bien comprendre ça aujourd'hui et moi qui peux répondre nous et puis découvrir les aspects culturels et puis linguistiques là qui sont très importants. Alors, c'est un entrée partie culturelle là. Parce qu'il faut déjà nous savoir qui nous est. Et pour savoir qui nous est, il faut nous savoir qui ça qui a l'entour nous. Si nous savons qui ça qui a l'entour nous, nous pouvons découvrir ça qui déroule. Donc, pour l'aspect culturel linguistique, nous avons fait des recrutements. Moi, je dis que nous avons 742 professeurs qui ont fait créer l'école. Alors, c'est les animateurs qui ont allé où c'est Mounta. Ils ont dit que Mounta sont bon, mais ils ont allé où après et nous avons formé Mouna pour nous faire créer l'école. Mais pour ça, il y a une formation et puis accompagnement. Ça veut dire qu'il ne faut pas nous oublier que c'est mon besoin que nous disions comment il y a fait pour ne pas faire bêtises et que nous continuons suivre pour que si un jour il y a pas de force pour nous continuer à avoir force pour nous continuer l'humidifier, bah yo flamme là pour yo continuer à avancer. Donc Martinique là différemment donc un cycle de chamaï de 2 ans à 5 ans et de chamaï de 6 ans à 9 ans nous avons fait plutôt à l'oral. Ça veut dire que nous pas demander de chamaï là écrit et à partir de 9 ans 11 ans là il a commencé à lire et puis écrit créole. Donc c'est comme ça nous découper bagaille la Martinique pour nous essayer d'avancer. Donc, en les parties culturelles là, nous avons essayé de faire différents, ni les fêtes calendrier, la Noël, Carnaval, signer des bails comme ça, événements culturels, par exemple, Martinique, nous avons créé le tour de Martinique de Yolgon, nous avons fait un tour en bateau autour du pays, c'est qu'à faire un événement culturel, environnement, là, tout ça qui est à côté, il n'y a été en côté ni des pieds bois, ni des bagages importants pour qu'il faut y apprendre libre. Et puis les sites incontournables, ça peut être en mairie, ça peut être en l'église, ça peut être en place, ça peut être en statue, en monument, que nos commandés savent c'est qui ça, parce que c'est bon caillou, il faut savoir qui ça est qu'à représenter. Ça y est en tout cas. Donc, l'approche contrastive, là, on parle des autres que nous avons développé Martinique là, en les 3 pans. Alors, ni des gens qui étaient qu'à comparer chaque mot à dans la langue pour dire qui ça veut dire. Mais par contre, nous allons aller plus loin. Nous allons essayer au niveau son qui différencie entre les différents sons, que là, on apprend l'alphabet en anglais, c'est pas même manière qu'on apprend l'alphabet en français. Il y a des sons qui sont différents. Donc, bien comprendre comment on va prononcer, là, comment on va entendre. Ensuite, en le lexique et puis culturel là, c'est vocabulaire là, et puis tout ça qui est culturel, nous faisons un seul patch et puis partie syntaxique là, comment on est l'anglais organisé. Est-ce les mots à la même place là, comment on est là organisé. Donc, c'est pour analyser l'anglais, pour apprendre à réfléchir, quels que soient les mots qui doivent que vous apprendre à réfléchir, les vous parler, même les vous écrire. Donc, mais Martinique, nous avons fait aussi des projets et puis d'autres missions, à part mission créole là, ni mission art, monde qui a fait la créativité, ni mission musique, ni mission sport. Et nous avons travaillé sur ces missions-là pour faire différents projets qui ont fait créole là rentrer en dynamique. Donc, nous avons des projets à deux missions, on nous manger pays, c'est pour ça qui a concerné tout ça, nous avons mangé. Ça, c'est la Caraïbe, nous avons parti de la Martinique, l'école Chamaïla, ensuite des communes là, ensuite des villes là, et puis ensuite des Martinique, et puis après nous arrivons les îles, Sainte-Lucie, Dominique, et puis ensuite nous avons fait grandir pour Chamaïla la partie du Bokaili, et puis qu'il grandit en toute la Caraïbe. Ça, c'est danser et chanter pays pour nous valoriser aussi au niveau les dansants et puis les chants qui en pays qui fait en créole, et puis comment nous pouvons sens les mots qu'il a. Et puis, nous faire un journal numérique, un journal en l'Internet, et puis nous avons valorisé tout ça, nous avons fait en créole. Alors, tout ça qui a respecté les programmes-là que je m'ont montré avant, il y a des programmes qui ont dit nous, qui ça il faut nous faire. Donc, tous ces projets-là qui a respecté programme là, yo ba nous. Nous ni en liberté pour nous faire ça nous envie, mais il faut nous entrer dans les programmes, donc nous développer qu'il a comprendre ça, il attend là, qu'il a lire et qu'il a comprendre des bagailles et tout ça en créole. Donc, nous, l'autre travail que nous mettons en place, c'est un travail de recherche, mais c'est pour parler à dit en recherche universitaire. Donc, au niveau premier degré à primary, nous avons essayé de travailler aussi en leur travail de recherche sur des dossiers pédagogiques. Ça veut dire un dossier où nous avons travaillé les parties historiques, scientifiques et pédagogiques. Donc, nous avons fait des cartes mentales pluridisciplinaires. Ça veut dire nous avons pris un thème, nous avons pris carnaval. Et puis, carnaval là, nous avons que ni en partie historique, ça veut dire depuis qu'il y a un carnaval arrivé, il y a des masques carnaval, des costumes carnaval. Alors, ces costumes, est-ce qu'ils ont déjà fait avant? Est-ce qu'ils ont été fait en Afrique? Est-ce qu'ils ont fait en Europe? Est-ce qu'ils ont fait en Amérique? Côté masque a sorti, costume a sorti. Et puis, nous avons dit comment on peut faire dans toute matière. On peut faire en français, on peut faire en anglais, on peut faire en histoire, on peut faire en sciences, on peut faire dans plusieurs matières. Et puis ces bagages-là, nous avons fait des fiches de séquence, des fiches de séance pour que nous puissions battre les collègues-là en outils qu'on peut utiliser. Même si vous pas utiliser des outils à conyer, au moins ça a l'idée pour savoir qui ça vous peut faire les élèves en fonction du niveau élève, en fonction de qui ça élève qu'à comprendre, vous pouvez essayer de gérer bagages-là. Mais nous avons des bonnes idées pour que vous puissiez débrouiller et puis c'est là à l'école. Donc, monsieur, pour parler des différents manières faites, nous avons parlé de recherche scientifique, recherche universitaire, ouvrage créole bilingue ou trilingue. Ça veut dire que, par exemple, nous faisons semaine créole matinique, moment des les animateurs moyens fait proposer des livres qui ont fait français, anglais, créole. Pour que tu aies là, relation plusieurs langues, pour qu'ils puissent rentrer dans plusieurs langues. Donc, ouvrage didactique et pédagogique, là, c'est les formateurs et les universitaires là. Et puis, production d'enseignants, ça qui a fait dans l'intérieur, ça, les professeurs, Jacques a fait, pour nous appuyer les ça, Jacques a fait, pour valoriser ça, Jacques a fait, et puis peut-être pour montrer les autres là, ça, Jacques a fait qui a marché bien. Donc, là, je vais passer mon manuel là, Antoine, là, il parle de formation, formation initiale, ça nous a fait au départ, bah, c'est professeur qui est arrivé, qui finit arrivé professeur, et puis qui a besoin d'apprendre à faire créole l'école. Ah, ou Manuela. Manuela.
Mr. Werner, is Manuela a co-host so that she can unmute?
Done.
Manuela, vous arrivez ou pas?
Ok. Bien bonjour tout le monde. Bien bonjour. Moi, désolée, c'est parce que moi essayé de brancher, mais mon pâté est arrivé, mon pâté n'y doit rentrer. Bien bonjour tout le monde. Alors, je prends la suite. Je vais commencer par dire tout le monde merci. Et puis, je vais continuer beaucoup l'épisode sans m'empêcher trop de bagailles à tout ça qui finit dit là. Mais il faut que vous savent qui dans tout ça, tout le monde dit depuis bon matin, on y a un pile de bagailles à tous en matinique. Monsieur professeur de Vanish parlait dit.
Je te rappelle.
Oui. Allô?
On peut continuer.
Oui. Alors, professeur de Vanish parlait des affaires virer porter l'anglan fait qu'il mon pays a même comprendre qu'il l'anglan c'est en langue yo et puis en langue maman yo et puis papa yo et tchébé et c'est vrai qu'ils sont en gros travail qui pour fait mais faut que ça que l'école matinique c'est l'État qui a amené même si nous ni la possibilité mettez en la sauce nous. Donc, jeudi jour, manqué parler de formation initiale qui c'est en moment temps et qui en monde qui pour faire l'école matinique obligé de passer en concours et pour passer concours ça, ben il y a formé. Mon panilon mais un soutien pour Ama. Oui. Qui moun ka, oui. Est-ce qu'on moun peut faire, alors, on moun peut, qui moun ka meyen diaporama, c'est pas moi, mon pani l'en mon pani l'en met à sous diaporama. René à sous l'autre bague. Mon pani l'en met à sous diaporama. René.
Oui, je vais avancer pour toi. Il suffit que tu me dises et je fais avancer pour toi.
Alors, qui ça manque à faire? Si l'on met chaque léa?
Alors, non, on y parle, manque à gérer.
Alors, la formation initiale là qu'a faite, c'est en formation d'université. Donc, depuis la réforme, première réforme enseignement, nous pas qu'à dire en mon professeur, c'est en professeur et puis on recherchait tout. Qui veut dire pour appuyer sous la science pour mener l'école. Donc, je dis jour, il y a une réforme qui doubout. Loi a passé en 2019, mais c'est première l'année nous qu'a mis en route, c'est l'année là. Alors, réforme t'a commandé nous, il y en a, ça moun qu'a apprendre en théorie et puis ça y a fait on dit dans l'école là. Oui, on peut continuer. Et bagay ta la qu'a fait et puis l'INSPE qui sont en l'école interne, l'Université des Antilles. Est-ce que vous pouvez avancer? Oui. Alors, jeudi jour, nous ni des camps. Nous ni des moun qui a fait l'école bâtie l'école et des moun qui a fait l'école grand l'école et grand l'école nous a dit c'est collège et puis lycée. Alors à sous manière yo ka découper formation nous ni presque la moitié si l'on niveau A qui a sous c'est la connaissance disciplinaire et puis épistémologique. 20% à sous la pédagogie, manière gérer classe là, 15% à sous la recherche, parce qu'on pour actualiser ça, la science qu'a dit, à sous ça, il qu'à apprendre ces moments là, et puis 10% à sous contexte régional, c'est un bagage qui permet de nous trapper stratégiquement, plislet pour faire créole, justement, mais ça aussi, c'est important parce que vous ne pouvez pas apprendre en monde si vous ne pouvez pas tenir compte de ça hier. Est-ce que vous pouvez avancer, René? Oui. Alors, formation systémique, il n'est pas cloisonné, ça parlait de nous qui fait en temps et qui on n'a qu'à apprendre à sous créole, en temps et il a gardé qui m'en est pour mettre dans classe là, qui m'en est pour gérer ces élèves-là à côté, et puis qui m'en est peut-être l'institution qui attend, il réussit, fait travail, et puis cet moment-là réussit tout. Eh bien, toutes ces bagailles-là, il y en a pilote qui a fait un seul bloc, et dans distribution, ces cours-là, nous avons 4 grandes catégories. Nous n'ayons sous la connaissance, nous n'ayons sous manière fait l'école, nous n'ayons sous, puis c'est cet moment-là nous avons essayé de faire ici. Donc, et puis, quatrième là, c'est manière nous en professeur pour ça, est-il arrivé, et cet moment-là qui arrivé, si il a progressé. Donc, nous avons essayé de garder, nous avons pesé, si ça nous fait à bon ou pas bon, pour essayer de virer, ranger. René. Alors, c'est l'autre travail, puis, et c'est pas seulement associé dès l'année master, là, ça qu'a passé, depuis pas côté licence là, c'est étudiant en l'occasion, dans l'année, deuxième l'année, troisième l'année licence là, garder titac, ça y a fait pas à côté d'école, et puis, en formation initiale, il y a dès l'année 3 et puis l'année 4 là, premier l'année master là, il y a profondir ça, il va apprendre à sous l'école et puis discipline là, et puis manier faire l'école là. Et puis, quatrième l'année, il y a aller en pratique plus à danser l'école là, et puis il y a passer concours là. Mais après ça, il y a encore en formation continue, qui veut dire il y a dans responsabilité à dans classe pendant toute l'année. Et puis, en formation continue, juste en yo, entrer la retraite, il y a l'occasion d'améliorer tout ça, yo apprendre. Oui, oui. Alors, à ce premier degré, nous, pour travail créole, à sous sa mission, professeur devenu l'a dit, nous essayons, nous rendre nous prend en compte qui en pile professeur les yoka les hommes qui a fait des titres il a fait de contact et puis Creole donc et puis il pas qu'à garder contexte Martinique en pile donc nous qu'à travailler contexte pays à dans des sens pour moun réapproprier koyo titak ça qui alentour et puis aussi c'est pour ouvrir koyo puisque Martinique a dans la Caraïbe et a dans le monde. Alors, enseigner créole là-bas, au premier degré important, puisque c'est ni en comme René Fili dit nous, ni en cadre pour respecter. Donc, il y a apprendre qui cadre, ça y est. Et puis, nous avons apprendre à travailler langue en lui-même. Et puis, tout ça, langue capoté, parce qu'on ne peut pas apprendre en langue sans qu'il y a qui capoté là. Alors, au premier degré, tout mon mail premier degré, première année master là, qu'a fait créole, et il y a la possibilité de choisir à sous deuxième année, ça nous a créé une spécialité pour professeur premier degré, spécial créole, qui a eu l'occasion pas passer l'habilitation, les yoké à souterrain. L'habilitation, c'est en circuit, René Moutama parlait d'Ila Taléa. René. Alors, nous avons proposé aussi, c'est mon mail l'INSPEA, à sous parcours collège et puis lycée, ça fait contexte pays, parce qu'il y a aussi collège et puis lycée, nous avons des petits mails tout côté Cavini, même manière et puis premier degré. Donc, nous avons travaillé en pile à sous ça, nous avons créé plurilinguisme et multiculturalité, mais aussi interculturalité. Mais il y a eu l'occasion aussi de travailler créole à sous deuxième année, à sous master 2 là. Master 2A. Oui. Et puis, nous avons ça manque à créer parcours pour apprendre mon créole, collège et puis lycée. Alors, il y a capi à sous en pile bagaille. Nous y entend important à sous qu'il discipline créole, qui veut dire l'anthropologie, l'histoire, qui ça et ça. Mais nous qu'apprendre spécial à sous traduction, parce qu'on travaille version et puis thème là, passer d'un langue à l'autre, mais pas seulement et puis français, mais et puis d'autres langues. Donc, contrastif là, nous qu'à travailler et puis en dynamique plurilingue. Alors, nous, à sous ingénierie et puis pratique pédagogique, nous qu'à en pile à sous manière pour adapter et puis lire ces grilles d'évaluation pour ces professeurs, ça fait l'école là, mais une classe bien. Et quand c'est important, puis c'est créole là, il y a apprendre ces petits moments-là, nous qu'à travailler en pile, matcher et puis parler créole là. Et puis, il y a entraîner Koyo, ces concours-là qui a fait à la fin, en deuxième semestre, Master 2A. Alors, ça, pour ça, c'est pour bout, presse, mon pédi, c'est important, nous, travail créole là, parce que nous, dans côté la Caraïbe, était toute langue qui a roulé. Donc, ça fait plurilinguisme là, important même. Multiculturalité aussi, parce qu'il faut respecter en l'autre pays, on ne peut pas forcer, ça y pas mais en même temps, interculturalité est important aussi, puisque mon Cavini vit ici, il y a qu'à rentrer en logique qui bataille, mais il y a qu'à apprendre à vivre puis. Et puis, c'est important aussi, qui nous a essayé de faire toutes ces professeurs, en tous les cas, virer, prendre en considération et puis virer service à qui alentour pour faire l'école. Oui, René. Alors, nous, ça m'a dit aussi des l'enseignement qui pas dans l'enseignement normal là. Nous, en professeur, je dis jour en France et puis ici, il y a même aussi, il peut faire mon travail français dans d'autres pays, il peut servir ça mon café d'autre côté, quand elle la Caraïbe, Sainte-Lucie, ou bien d'autre côté, pour travailler piblin. Et puis en même temps, il peut aussi préparer master là, sans ni l'intention, venir professeur en jour. Donc ça, nous a créé la vie professionnelle, puis ni des gens qui ont monté de l'entreprise culturelle et ils ont apprendre un monde en l'eau bagaille à ce qu'il et puis langue créole. Mon bout. Actuellement, mon pari pour nous peut continuer ou nous peut virer prendre en main. Bien, merci tout le monde.
Alors, bien, merci tout le monde pour tout ça. Les deux dernières parties, c'était manière pour nous échanger entre les différents mondes qu'il a pour savoir qui ça nous peut porter basot, porter bas Saint-Licy, bas gouvernement Saint-Licy, bas l'éducation Saint-Licy. Donc, les nous qui arrivons dans les échanges là, nous pouvons parler de ça. Puisque nous avons si autres des questions, si autres des bagailles pour demander nous. Je peux demander nous à présent ou les Angèle qui a décidé que nous puissions échanger et puis que nous puissions parler. Donc, nous présenter les autres ça nous fait au pays, que ce soit en primary and secondary. Après, ces autres cas, ouais, comment les autres, ouais, et puis qui ça autres besoin en plus comme renseignement.
Et puis, moi, je voulais dire un gros merci pour tout ça, autres déjà présenté là. C'est un chai, mais intéressant. Nous avons joindre des idées qui mènent nous à faire même chose là en l'école nous ici.
OK.
Et puis des points, moi,
Ou t'es songé, ou t'es pensé? OK.
Oui. Manière, c'est moi qui a instruit, c'est même là, il y a une certification, la formation pour eux toutes, la un chai support pour eux en classe là. So, moun qui a fait inspecteur, moun qui a fait coordinateur, je ne sais pas connaître qui pour des coordinateurs, mais c'est qualité si pour ça, en classe. Et puis, ou tenir un bel plan pour qui manière ou te vle ouais Creole là, apprendre Creole là en l'école. Moi aimé ça. I also noted that correlation between what Professor Devonish mentioned earlier, the fact that there was a national language policy under which the education policy was subsumed. Ou tenir un politique nationale et ou tenir politique éducation. So that was meaningful as well. I like the mention of the code switching. I like the mention of students, taking students from where they are in terms of what their linguistic competence was and helping them move further along. There were many really great points that came out of this presentation, including the focus on the linguistic, the cultural, the training and support, and even the research, much of which has been mentioned by the other presenters as well. Thank you very much. Merci. Nous allons poser question plus tard.
Okay.
During our question and answer session. Merci, Martinique. And since we have had so much talk of teacher training, I think this is the perfect time for us to pass you on to Dr. Kathy Depredine, who will present that teacher education perspective. Now, she herself has been a teacher for the last 24 years. She's very passionate about language learning and teaching in Creole or vernacular context. She is currently the head of the Modern Language Learning Unit at the South Louis Community College. And she was a member of the 2017 OECS Haitian Haiti mission. They visited Haiti to look at how home language instruction was being implemented. And she was part of the planning committee for the Solution Language Policy and Instruction Conference that was held in 2017. And of course, being a member of the Linguistic Society of America and the Society of Caribbean Linguistics, she has presented a number of papers on Creole and vernacular instruction. So for the next few minutes, we will listen to Dr. Depredine as she will present that teacher education perspective for us. On to you, Dr. Depredine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ms. Caglin. I am not able as yet to share my screen. Yes. Okay, we'll do so right now. Okay, I shall first, okay. Okay. Thanks again, Ms. Caglin. Good morning, everyone. As Ms. Caglin indicated, my task here this morning is to discuss the implications that embarking on including Creole language instruction as part of our overall plan for national language education would have. I want to proceed articulating that any attempt at including Creole in language instruction or in instruction, or it has to be understood that Creole instruction is part of the larger plan for language instruction. It is part of the larger plan for the development of biliteracy, multiliteracies, okay, and ultimately multilingualism. So it is not a plan for looking at Creole instruction in isolation, but as I've said, it will be a plan that would be part of the overall plan for language instruction. Of course, if we are to go ahead, when it comes to teacher education, there are certain things to which, or certain questions, or certain issues which we must give due consideration. Once a teacher completes training, once a teacher completes training, I want to put forward that that teacher should be able to articulate answers to the following two questions. That teacher, in short, should be able to give a rationale or explain, first off, why it is important to include Creole in instruction. Why? That teacher should also be able to articulate how Creole instruction should proceed. Now, it is not only important for the teacher to be able to articulate answers to those questions, but having that knowledge, we would expect to translate into the teacher's classroom practice in order for the teacher to be effective in terms of the execution of his or her duties. So these would be the important considerations for any teacher training program. So to take the first question, why engage in Creole instruction? Why should we include Creole as part of our approach for national language education? In other words, why should we have Creole, or what is the rationale for including Creole in language instruction? In order to do so, we would have to ensure that whatever program is designed for the inclusion of Creole, and whatever program is designed to train teachers to use Creole, the program has to be such that it clearly defines the current language situation in St. Lucia. It recognizes all of the existing language varieties, and also recognizes the language learning, the context within which all of the recognized language varieties would be interacting. I have argued elsewhere that what would exist in a St. Lucian classroom is in fact a language learning situation. And I have looked at it from the premise that whether a child's first language is the Creole influenced vernacular, which some persons may refer to as English Creole or Creole English, whether that variety is the child's first language, or whether the child's first language is in fact French Creole, in order for the child to develop proficiency in standard English, that child must engage in the deliberate study of the differences, whether it is those differences between Creole and the standard variety, or that child would have to engage in the study of the deliberate study of the differences between the Creole influenced vernacular and the standard variety. So there must be deliberate attention paid to those fundamental differences that exist between the language varieties. So the training program has to equip teachers to themselves be able to define the language situation, recognize the varieties that are interacting, and of course, be able to identify the characteristics of, ultimately identify the characteristics of their learners when they come to them in the language classroom. The training program also has to be very clear in terms of articulating how Creole fits into the larger plan for developing bilingualism, biliteracy, or ultimately multilingualism and multiliteracy. And not only must it articulate how Creole fits in there, the program must reflect, or the program must reflect how Creole fits into those general plans. Of course, very, very important also would be getting teachers to understand the socio-cultural benefits of having students exposed to Creole in instruction. These benefits include having students develop an appreciation for Creole as part of what makes us uniquely St. Lucian, appreciating Creole as part of our cultural identity as a people. And of course, there has to be a focus on the cognitive benefits for bilingual learners. Of course, I heard Mr. Mutma and Ms. Antoine allude to those cognitive benefits earlier on. For instance, one of the benefits, the cognitive benefits for would be that once a child develops early bilingualism, it becomes much easier for that child now to learn multiple languages later on. That is one benefit here. It was also mentioned earlier, one of the other cognitive benefits being metalinguistic awareness, the ability of the child now to pay more attention to language use or his or her use of language, the ability to make comparisons between perhaps what is his or her first language and of course the language to be learned or the target language, whether that target language is standard English or any other language for that matter. Another benefit, another cognitive benefit for learners would be divergent thinking, creativity, communicative sensitivity, okay? And of course, I will say again that the teacher education program has to be designed such that teachers gain an understanding of why. What are the potential, what is Creole's place in the larger plan? And of course, what are some of the benefits to be derived from the inclusion of that language in instruction? So we move on to question 2. How then should Creole instruction proceed? And that should be the other aim of any teacher education program. It should be able to not only equip teachers with the why, but also the how, the methodology which they should employ when in the language classroom. In order to do so, the teacher education program should first off ensure that not only the teachers in training, but also but most importantly, the teacher trainers are in fact proficient in Creole. And when we say proficient here, we refer to both oral and written, exhibiting both oral and written competency in the language. That is critical if those individuals are supposed to impart or to be able to get students to develop, learners to develop literacy skills in Creole. It is also important for teachers to understand what they are dealing with in the classroom, or they have to deal with in the classroom. They need to understand the learner characteristics. And the way to do that is to understand or to be able to identify the language profiles of those students who come into the language classroom. We understand that our students come in with different languages. Some of them have a Creole influence vernacular as the first language. Others come in with Creole as the first language, and others still come in with Standard English as a first language. Teachers have to be able to identify, to be able to test students to determine what their language profiles are. And that is whether or not they have Creole as a first language. Another consideration is the fact that the learners will exhibit varying levels of competence, both in Creole and of course in English. So the teachers have to be able, and that comes through the program, to be able to identify those critical characteristics. It is important to be able to identify learner characteristics because that makes planning for instruction more effective. It will ensure that planning for instruction is suited to those identified characteristics. Now, in order to be able to do so, teachers would need to have a clear understanding on the distinctions that exist between the various language varieties. They would need to understand, for instance, and that is very, very important. And the point has been made earlier that in terms of our linguistic situation, there are more speakers of the Creole influence vernacular. So it is critical for teachers to be able to identify the characteristics of each language variety. Each one has a special role to play in terms of developing multilingualism and multiliteracy. So it is important now to be able to differentiate between the characteristics of Standard English and the characteristics of the Creole influence vernacular. And of course, to look at how the standard variety differs, the structure of the standard variety differs from that of Creole. These differences would be both in terms of structure, in terms of vocabulary, etc. But it is important that teachers have that fundamental understanding to be, again, effective in terms of instruction. Another key element of the instructional program would be getting teachers to develop skills on how to develop phonological awareness in their students. That here is very, very important because it is generally accepted that reading or developing literacy skills is linked to the development and refinement of phonological processing skills. Now, just to link that to the point that I made earlier, phonological awareness is one example of the metacognitive or metalinguistic abilities which I referenced earlier on. Now, all of what I have stated here or identified here has to be reflected in the structure of the program. The program would have to look at or include what we consider to be best practices in order for all of those elements here to come out, in order for the teachers in training to develop or to pick up all of the skills which would be necessary for in classroom instruction. So that takes me to my other point here, which is that the teacher training program must provide teachers in training to pedagogy or to methodologies for instruction, which is eclectic, which does not focus on one methodology, but essentially would look at all of those best practices which would facilitate or which would encourage the development of multiliteracy or multilingualism. The instruction has to be student-centered. It has to cater to a heterogeneous groups of learners. It has to recognize that that is in fact the kind of classroom in most instances with which teachers would be presented in a St. Lucian context. Not only a class with learners with one set of characteristics, but a diverse set of skills, a classroom which would have learners with different language profiles, yeah? And of course, the teachers would have to be encouraged to all of those practices which would encourage the development of literacy skills. Again, the program would have to be designed such that there's a lot of modeling of all of those practices, all of those approaches to instruction. One of those approaches is the tripartite model of vernacular instruction, which has been proposed by Professor Hazel Simmons MacDonald, and of course the L'École Vivant approach, which is used by Innoved in Haiti. These provide detailed guidelines on how such programs can be approached and the methodological approaches which can be applied in order to ensure that the student's first language, in this instance, Creole, becomes a critical part of language instruction, which is geared at developing multiliteracy and multilingualism. As mentioned earlier, in the very same way that the learners in a language classroom would present with various competencies, we would expect that the teachers themselves would have various varying competencies in Creole. So it would be the responsibility of of teacher educators to ensure that there are upskilling opportunities for teachers. For instance, there may be teachers who have oral competence in Creole, but not the literacy skills, or vice versa. So while there may be full teacher education programs, provisions must be made for also short-term training programs, which would equip teachers with the skills necessary to function effectively in a language classroom. So there ends my presentation, and thank you for your attention. Merci en pile.
Et puis merci Shai, Dr. Depredine. I really appreciated the focus and the building of your presentation around the two questions: why Creole, and essentially how Creole, and really emphasizing that, effective teaching practices are effective teaching practices. It's being student-centered, being responsive, understanding the needs of learners, whatever they may be, and acknowledging that there will be a mix of abilities, linguistic abilities in our classrooms. And as well highlighting some of the methodology and strategies that would be effective in instruction. So there's a lot of food for mulling on by teacher education, and of course, integrating all of that into whatever else comes into implementing our policy. We did promise you a break after this presentation, so we would like to just take a 5-minute break just to stretch your legs, have some water, rest your eyes, after which we will have the two presentations that focus more primarily on the St. Lucian context by Dr. Dalfinis. So he will speak with us for a little bit on what are some suggestions, and we will wrap up with Professor Hazel Simmons MacDonald showing us how we use the research that has been done already to implement Creole instruction in the classroom. So see you all in 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, good afternoon. And we are back from our break. I hope that you were able to refresh yourselves a bit. And without further ado, we will get right into our next presentation. We have with us Dr. Morgan Dalfinis, who will be looking at some suggestions for language policy implementation for St. Lucia. Just a little bit about Dr. Dalfinis. He was born in St. Lucia. He migrated to England around age 11, and he has published many articles and about 5 books on Caribbean and African languages and other educational issues. He has taught at all education levels except the primary level, and he has worked as a general, senior, and chief inspector of schools in the London Education Authorities. He has worked with teacher training colleges, and one of his qualifications is a PhD in Caribbean and African languages. So let's give Dr. Dalfinis our attention and just listen to some of his suggestions for implementing our language policy. Thank you, Dr. Dalfinis.
Okay, so katan moi?
Moi katan nou.
Oh, bien. An pale. Ok, merci bien pour ba moi si occasion sa la pour parler ba zot. I am very pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you all. In terms of my main sources, it's the Statistical Digest of the Government of St. Lucia, and it's a presentation based on a lecture on costs and language policy in St. Lucia. What I'm going to do, however, in this presentation is focus only on the implementation plan section of it. The background for me is the non-investment into education of the African population in St. Lucia by French and English enslavers in St. Lucia from 1640 up to 1840. This was followed for me by benign neglect of literacy in Creole by St. Lucian governments from both political parties in 42 years of independence since 1979. It assumes that the policy targets introducing Creole in the St. Lucian curriculum is that policy target, and it is not a language policy for all languages in St. Lucia, although this is an important part of the introduction and maintenance of Creole, and indeed any language policy in any country. What I've done in the implementation plan is split it up into sections, namely what stages. Often at times people talk about infant, secondary, or in other cases about key stages. What year this plan is in, the ages of the pupils, the actions needed, and the estimated costs in teaching days, i.e. would the actions suggested take 1 teaching day or 2 teaching days? In terms of the principles in curriculum and finance, I'd see it as taking at least 15 years to complete. It starts in the way that Professor Devenish recommends in third world countries. It starts with primary first and completes primary before moving on into secondary. While primary is being started in the secondary curriculum, I think that language awareness classes about Creole in St. Lucian society and Creole in the Caribbean and internationally can be done within the current language arts curriculum hours, while the intake is developing up the curriculum line. I think we need to agree intended targets for each year of implementation and a quality review at the end of each year to see where we are going, where we're succeeding, where we're failing, and what the political environment is. I think CAMDU always develop teacher training materials anyway, but in the Creole case, I'd be seeing the materials prepared 1 year before the next group, i.e. 1 year in advance of when the teaching materials are used. Reviews of best practice from the year before should be disseminated in national annual in-service courses for teachers. I'd say for preparation, 2 years of preparation for primary as a phase should be built in, and 2 years of preparation for secondary as a phase should be implemented. So my 15 years builds into it preparation for each phase. In my costing in teaching days, I converted them into EC dollars using the unit costs provided by the language policy draft. 4,242 EC per primary pupil and 4,641 EC per secondary pupil. Given 190 teaching days per year, this would convert to 22.32 EC per day per primary pupil and 33.37 EC per day per secondary pupil. In summarizing the implementation for stages 1 and 2, i.e. the years 2021 to 2022, no ages of pupils are involved then. People should then be preparing. There should be programs of study and assessment, schemes of work, and approved Creole grammar, and teaching materials for the next stages 3 and 4. A training of teacher training specialists in language and teacher training policy should also be evolved, as well as the teacher training program and the teacher trainers themselves. I estimate 1,430 days in terms of teacher training days. For the stages 3 to 7, i.e. the years 2023 to 2027, the ages would be 5 to 9. I'd envisage trained teachers teaching Creole, 1 specialist Creole and language teaching specialist per school, and a quality review of the previous stages against intended targets. My estimated costs in teaching days there are 2,021.5. For the next dates, 2023 to 2027, again, still looking in the primary phase, specialist language teachers would support other teachers on Creole, English, and other language issues, such as phonics, as well as drafting the school language policy and its own local implementation plan. Again, estimated cost given at around 2,000 plus teaching days. For the years 23-27, again in primary, policies would then be reviewed and approved by the school inspector and submitted to the education officer within nationally established policies and review cycles. I think a national board needs to be set up to view amendments needed to the Creole dictionary on a 5-yearly basis. The estimated costs in teaching days there being around 2,000. In terms of stages 8 to 9, the years then being 2028 to 29, we're arriving at the 10 to 11-year-olds. As for the stages 3 to 7 in primary, and at secondary, preparation of teaching materials, teacher training, schemes of work, and teachers for implementing the secondary Creole teaching. Estimated costs around 700 plus 700 to 800 teaching days. As far as stages 10 to 15, the years 2030 to 2036, it's secondary focused, and trained teachers would then become ready to teach in secondary schools, giving the ages of the pupils of 12 to 17 and estimated costs around 700 to 800 teaching days. I then look at the cost of implementation by taking each year of implementation and calculating the teaching days and then multiplying them by the unit costs that I'd earlier mentioned. 22.32 EC primary and 33.37 EC secondary, giving me a grand total of 32,000 plus in EC. One of the issues among many and conclusions is that the unit cost quoted within the statistics document may not or may have included daily costing of teaching salaries. Whatever shape they're put in, that amendment needs to be made. Secondary and primary could happen simultaneously, thus reducing the time of implementation. That's a critique on a draft given to me by Joel Charlemagne. While that could be the case, I think it is wiser to build, even though it's long term, year by year, in a kind of trusted way in which you know what the intake has learned before you move them on. In a way, the new intake will always be dissimilar to the previous intake who have not had all of the benefits of all of those years that we're accruing in terms of Creole-related education. Another critique given to me was, will teaching hours for Creole mean adding curriculum hours or the displacement of some existing topics or subjects? Those, again, are more local decisions. I don't see it really as a necessary replacement, but really looking at the curriculum as enrichment, and how do you enrich it with a new topic or new curriculum item called Creole. Obviously, at times, people then have to make decisions as to what their priorities are. The UNESCO Decade of Indigenous Languages, I think fairly soon, if we're not already in it, should be bid for in order to gain resources for the implementation plan. In summary, I'd say that many of the perspectives already raised by speakers are congruent with where we want to get to. I'd say the perspective given on teacher training has been very clear by the previous speaker, and I think cuts through lots of the very valuable inputs that we all seek to bring to it. I will stop at this point and hope that I can move back to Angel. Lastly, sorry, I'd forgotten the last 2 points that I'd wanted to make. Namely, although they were on the PowerPoint, I didn't see it. Where matigade bien. I looked, but I didn't observe well. European enslavers did not invest in our literacy education for at least 200 years. 42 years since independence, we must demonstrate, I think, more vigorously our ability and capacity to sustain, invest in, and develop ourselves, malgré tout, regardless of everything. Because at the end of the day, that is really the purpose of us existing despite all of the oppression that we have been through. If it's not for a purpose of self-development, then we might as well call the old enslavers back and say, in the time that we were given, we did not search for freedom. We did not see freedom in ourselves. We did not see hope in ourselves, and thus we did not invest in ourselves. I think the issue of Creole is part of it, but really what we're fundamentally talking about is how to evolve ourselves even further cognitively. And to do that, we need to have a different vision of even issues such as Creole. Creole is, if you like, the surface, but what we're really talking about is how do we evolve a quality education system fit for the purpose of redemption within our own history. And it's not only a redemption from others, it's a redemption that we need to build for ourselves. I'll stop there, Angel. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dalfinis. You have given us a very direct and very well laid out plan that you're seeing for how we can go about implementing both at the primary and the secondary levels. And I would imagine that for a lot of us listening in, we're thinking again of how Martinique themselves are implementing at the primary and the secondary levels and their own systematic approach to doing so, coupled with the suggestions that we've received regarding teacher training and continuous support for our teachers. We really, really appreciate this presentation as well. And now we've come to our final presentation before we take some questions from those of you who have been patiently listening. We're looking at, based on research already done, what do we see as the approach to implementing Creole instruction in this specific context where that research has been done. I will hand you over now to Professor Hazel Simmons McDonald, and Dame Paulette Louise will be as well making some remarks in there. Our final presenter is Professor Emerita of Applied Linguistics at the University of the West Indies. In addition to teaching and research, she has served in several administrative posts. Her research has focused primarily on second language acquisition, Creole and Creole influenced vernaculars in education. And while her last post, she served as the chair of Caribbean Examinations Council, chair of the English A Review Committee, consultant for the policy on the OECS USAID Early Learners Program. And in fact, she was the one who drafted our language policy, the document that we all have been perusing for the last few months, was put together by Professor Hazel Simmons McDonald. She continues to work on her primary research interest and to write creatively. At this point, I'd like to pass you on to Professor Hazel Simmons McDonald.
Thank you very much, Ms. Caglin. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hope it comes through now. Let's see. Can you see that? Can you see that, Ms. Caglin?
It has not yet been projected. It's possibly on its way.
Okay. Please let me know. No?
Not as yet, no.
Oops, I did share screen, but let me go back to you here. And let me do share screen again. Let's close this. Share screen. No. Can you see that now?
Not as yet.
Oh my goodness, what am I doing wrong? Something wrong.
Do we have the PowerPoint open?
Yes, it is. And it's just what I practiced with you this morning, so it should be there. Unless, here it is. Can you see that? No. Share screen. Where is it? Here it is. Can you see that
There we
now?
go. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I apologize for, pardon, pour ça. Bonjour tout le monde, et merci pour moi chance là pour parler en teasing timiette à ce recherche là nous a fait en cette lycée. So the point that Professor Devonish has made, I'm bringing to our attention the broader implications for language and national language policy leads me to think that, of course, the focus by the government or the ministry on having this conference and focusing on language policy might suggest or might mean that they're looking at this as a pivotal point through which that whole process might start. And it may not be a bad place to begin because it will provide an opportunity for the kinds of awareness that's necessary to be for parents and for teachers to come on board with the concept of Creole as a national language. That might be a good motivation for it. So what I'm going to do is simply to focus on 3 studies which have been done within the St. Lucian context. Now that is not to deliberately intended to ignore other studies that have been done in other contexts in the Caribbean. For example, there's an excellent study, the BEP study that was done in Jamaica, in which we have a same lexicon Creole situation. And I'm sure at some point when we begin to look at SLEV much more closely, those results will be very important for us to look at. But for now, what I'd like to do simply is to draw attention to 3 studies in this particular context and focus on the issue of language acquisition and literacy, which are critical areas for achieving success, the kinds of success with language that we need in school settings, and even as we acquire languages naturally within our environment. So the 3 studies, the first one is one that I did in 1988, it's my PhD study, that drew my attention to the disadvantage of the French Creole speakers in a classroom when their language was simply not being taken into consideration, not being nurtured in any way. And to me, that was such an aberration, such a gross, I don't know, a sin I called it, because there were so many children being left out. And that led me to think about other ways in which we should be able to tailor instruction to bring all of our children into a classroom situation in which they were active learners, in which they would be happy to learn. And so the second study is the pilot study that I did to try using a bilingual approach with Creole and English. Now, the model I had developed does include the French, the English Creole influenced vernacular of SLEV or St. Lucian English vernacular. But because it was a limited time to do it, I did not take that particular variety into consideration at that point. The third study is one that was done by Depardine, in which she does consider both the Creole and the St. Lucian English vernacular. So I will refer to these very briefly, but in a sort of a different way. I'm going to start by looking at the findings of the first study that pointed to the negative effects of the learners in the absence of approaches that resulted in the acquisition of both the second language and literacy. And that was the big failure, I think, of education for most of our children who had to leave school. In a survey that I did later on, there were big boys of 12 and 13 just waiting in grade 6 to leave school without having even learned to recognize all of the alphabet in English or to speak, to actually read anything in English, even at the stage 1 level. So that, I think, we have failed our children miserably in that regard. And so the findings of that study will actually lead us to the other ones. The research in critical areas, I think, that led me to conceptualize a different approach or a series of different approaches, focus on the interdependence of first and second language, something that every teacher should know and should incorporate in his or her teaching. I will look at some of the findings and recommendations from work done in Creole influenced vernacular context by Cray and by Carrington primarily. And then I'm going to look at the issue of acquisition versus literacy learning, language acquisition in a naturalistic environment, and the whole issue of acquisition versus academic proficiency, because this is the crux of where teachers become very important and what we should do. And then with that having been established, I will go to look at the findings of study number 2 and study number 3. So I hope that will work well. So the first study was the acquisition of negation by speakers of French Creole. And I focused on a kindergarten class in La Guerre. And it was 5-year-olds who spoke French Creole exclusively when they came to school. They could not speak any English. The approach used in school was English as the mother tongue. And the children were sitting in a group by themselves while the teacher conducted the class in English for the rest of the class. And when she had some time, she would go sit with them and do things like counting bottle tops, so teaching them numeracy, and speaking to them in English. But that activity was only for a very limited time during the day, so they were not full participants in the classroom. At the end of the first year, all but one of the children had to repeat the first year. And that is something that, perpetuated itself throughout. At the end of 2.5 years, I went back to the school and I again interviewed the children. I sat in some of the classes in which they were taking lessons. And all of the children who were in my study, there were 14 of them, they lagged behind the children who were speaking English by 2 years because their peers had gone ahead and were now in grade 3 or 4, and they were behind by 2 years. 13 of the 14 who were in my study had to repeat every year, the same year in each successive class. And so at the end of 2 years, they were falling 2 years behind. Some of the children in the study, by virtue of their experience to learning in the classrooms, had acquired the English lexicon vernacular SLEV, and they were beginning to speak that with some kind of competence and proficiency. But none of them had actually acquired a level of competence in English or proficiency in English to allow them to handle the school tasks that were being set for them in English. And needless to say, none of them went on to do the common entrance, and they left school. Some of them, I won't go into the follow-up that I did when they were about 21 years old. So what I want to focus on then are some of the critical research areas and findings and recommendations that based on research done elsewhere and in the Caribbean, that began to shape the principles and the theory for approaching instruction for our children in a different way. So the first one has to do with the research that's done on first and second language interdependence. And some of the results and findings led people to make pronouncements like these. They noted the cross-lingual relationships between first and second language cognitive and academic development. In other words, as you learn, as you use language and you learn more than one language, if you nurture your first language, you begin to develop cognitive flexibility that really is beneficial for you. Generally across the board in all subjects. So when the students' cognitive and academic growth in their home language, the first language, is more fully developed, the child's proficiency and development in school tasks, academic development, is going to be deeper. So that's one of the key findings that came out of research with children who were French speaking, learning English as a second language. Another set of reports focused on the fact that if children learn skills in school, if they're required to learn skills in school, they do that more easily if they learn these skills in their first or home language, okay? And that having been said, it's easier for them to learn to read in their first language and apply that skill that they have learned in their first language to the second language, and the skills actually go over. They benefit from what they've learned in L1 and apply those to L2, rather than if you have them coming into class, not speaking the language of instruction, and you begin to teach them literacy in that. It's a big block and they cannot seem to get over that hump. That was the problem that I noticed with the children in my first study. But if they learn in their first language, the reading skill becomes automated through the first language, and then you can pay more attention to the acquisition of L2 through various approaches that you can use. So this is one of the main comments that were made on that set of studies, that if you want to assure cognitive and academic success in a second language, the student's first language system, both oral and written, has to be developed to a high cognitive level right through the elementary years. Now, oral here has to do with the kinds of experiences you give the child in speaking, in playing, in talking about all sorts of things in the environment. Is the development of their basic interpersonal communication skills. And that is so critical because it gives them a foundation with using the language, and then the written aspects can be developed as well. So that's one important principle that informed the study. Now, the second set of research comments I want to make have to do with recommendations coming from our own context in the Caribbean. For example, Craig came up, he did a lot of work and really very valuable studies, which we should all pay attention to. And he said, for example, he found when the learners are Creole influenced vernacular speakers acquiring the first language and literacy in it, one of the first prerequisites is that the teaching program must make provision for continuity in the learner's cognitive growth. That is to say, you have to use the first language to help the child to develop that cognitive flexibility and growth. He also focused on literacy programs in the official language. And these, he said, had to be to make provision for continued communicative growth in the vernacular. That is to say, you don't just tell the child, don't speak that and use a corrective approach. You have to help the child to begin to express it, like even with the slave, in ways that really indicate the grammaticality of the language, and help them to develop that communicative competence in their language, even as you help them to build competence as well in the L2. And the very important thing he said is because language precedes literacy, and because the first language of vernacular speakers is not the language of literacy, vernacular speakers need to begin to acquire the second language before they begin to read it. That is to say, before you can even begin to read the language, you have to be able to speak it. You have to know it. You have to know some of how the sentences shape out. That's the basic, and that's the importance of acquisition. And that's how children acquire the language as they grow up. And that's why if you acquire a language and you go to school and you're taught in that language, then literacy is not as difficult for you because you have a solid foundation for that language. So his recommendation was that as a precondition to teaching standard English, we have to make provision for our children's first language development to be continuous and complete. And I'd like to suggest that as we think of approaches, this is very important for us to think about. How do we make sure that we provide a continuous program that helps enrichment and nurturing of the first language that will help the students to actually acquire and develop literacy in the second language. That's one of the fundamental tenets that we need to focus on. Both Carrington and Craig came up with cautions, I think, for our system. And you will, if you read Carrington's early work on St. Lucia, with the publication that he did of his dissertation in 1984, he says the unacceptable high rate of functional illiteracy in the population would suggest that it is folly to persist with the current education policy in which English is the sole medium through which literacy can be achieved. Happily, we're now beginning to discuss how we might change this. And then Craig, also recognizing the difficulty, noted that if a monolingual standard in a language is promoted in a bilingual situation, the child's normal development in his or her language, Creole, becomes stifled, while at the same time the child fails to acquire native fluency in the language of the school. And that is precisely what happened to the children in the very first study that I did. They were stifled in terms of their development of their own native language because they could not read Creole and they spoke it, but then they could not read English either. So a lot of researchers have made the distinction between language acquisition and literacy learning, making the point that literacy acquisition is not language acquisition. You can only learn to read in a language that you understand. Maybe you can mouth the phonetic items if you can see, if you know what they are, but that doesn't mean that you are understanding necessarily what the meaning of the language. And then if children will have a problem if they are introduced to the second language without having their first language fully developed. Okay, so that's more or less counting to the same thing. Now, the other point I want to make is a critical one for, again, showing how we approach teaching, is the difference between what Cummins calls BICS and CAP, acquisition and proficiency. So basic interpersonal communication skills is what we use when we acquire a language, when we speak to each other, when we joke, when we have fun. It's all the informal aspects of the language, but you can also have a formal aspect of BICS too if you're making a little speech or something. On the other hand, CAP, cognitive academic language proficiency, is related specifically to literacy development. In other words, that particular kind of proficiency involves looking at language from an analytical point of view, using it for getting information, reading exposition in text, and for all the other purposes you need it across the subjects in school. Acquisition, on the other hand, is just communicative competence in a language, but both are important for helping to finally develop literacy, okay? So we go on then to the second study, which is the one that the vernacular instruction on the development of literacy abilities with French Creole speakers. I could not do, because it was an intensive 6-week program, I could not include this vernacular aspect in that study, but simply I was trying to prove a point with French Creole speakers. So that particular study was designed to cater to, it is designed, not the study, but the model is designed to cater to learners with all of the 3 different languages as their home language in St. Lucia. That's French Creole, the vernacular, and Standard English. But this particular study focused on children who spoke only Creole as their first language. And the school had identified them as being at risk for learning English. And so I took 6 weeks to go and try to do some initial work with them in terms of helping them to acquire communicative skills in English and helping them to develop literacy in Creole, and also to develop some measure of literacy in some of the at earlier stages of English, because they were now in stage, 2 of them were in stage 3 and 1 was in stage 6, and they could not read even a grade 1, grade 1 text, okay? So I modified the model, and what I used was single subject research design so that I could see how each child was progressing. Once I got data on where the child was, how the child was performing, then I did the interventions, and those interventions showed whether the child was developing in any way in both the home language, Creole, and English. So I was expecting, the model expects learner outcomes like development of proficiency in English, that would be literacy, as well as some communicative competence. Proficiency in the home, in the French Creole, that is, they should be able to read at grade level. Well, I have to make a little caveat here, because they were just learning to read. They had to start with the stage 1. In St. Lucia, they use stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So it would be K, which would be stage 1. They would have to start reading at that introductory level and then go on to stage 2 and stage 3, which is grade 1 and grade 2. And we also expected some development of bilingualism between the two languages and biliteracy in both of them to help them to develop proficiency in both. What are some of the results? That when we looked at the performance of the children in both languages, we saw that they were both languages were developing on par. That is, the use of the Creole was not bothering the acquisition of English in BICS or the development of literacy in that language. I should say that we assign time and task to both languages in such a way that students had full time for acquisition of communicative skills, and then with tasks that dealt with literacy-focused kinds of activities. When we looked at writing samples, for the boy who was in the grade 6 waiting to go out to school without taking common entrance, we noticed balanced development in his writing as well. He wrote stories in French Creole simply and in English as well, but most of them tended to have some errors with the E accent, like in Blake, for example, and in E. So you know the French Creole words, we use those two accents. And so these formed a little bit of difficulty for them, but it wasn't a difficulty that they could not overcome if focused on. And what I would say is that the whole approach helped them to develop reading ability in both English and in French Creole. The two of them began to read text at a higher level, at 2 levels higher than when we started. The guy who was in the 6th grade was actually reading at grade 4 by the end of the project, and he went on to do the common entrance. Just to show you a couple of graphs, this is the kind of balanced development that we saw through the intervention data. So the pink is Creole, and you notice he's starting over here much higher, and then English is lower, but as we go through, this is a more difficult text in Creole here. And here with English, he's getting higher scores and reading at a grade 4 and 5 level by the end of the period. And the Creole is not affecting at all that literacy development in English. And another one, a girl, she wasn't reading at all. So we started at kindergarten level, let's say, this below 0.50. And this is how she began to develop with English. Notice where her Creole was, because she had a foundation in Creole, she was able to hook on to the Creole much faster and do better. Here, I introduced a more difficult text, and she had a little difficulty with it, but there's where she went right after doing it, gaining some competence in doing that and recognizing. And the day she did it, she just realized she was reading. She hopped up from her chair and went to the principal and sang the whole way down, I can read, I can read, I can read. And so here we go. The third study is the Depredine study, where she looked at vernacular instruction on the development of kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2 students in a selected school. What she sought was to investigate whether the students who were exposed to a model of vernacular instruction, which included both English and Creole, would produce results when measures were taken of literacy indicators, reading, and phonological awareness. She chose subjects from the kindergarten, grade 1 and grade 2 from a multi-grade school. Her aim was to determine the impact of the vernacular instruction on the development of the children's literacy. And she conducted that experiment over 13 weeks. And in that time, the students were exposed to instruction in both Creole and English. The only difference between her study and mine was that she used Slev as one of the languages in the mix. And she taught teachers the kinds of approaches she wanted them to use. In my study, I actually went and taught them myself. So this was one of the differences. Now, here are some of the results of the Depredine study. The students who were bilingual, that is, children who came to school speaking both the vernacular English and the Creole, had higher reading scores than the children who were only speaking the vernacular. And she says it took these students less time to read independently in Creole than it did for them to do so in English, which is the same result I had found. All the students who at the beginning of the study were classified as bilinguals had higher reading accuracy scores in the French Creole than in English. 4 out of the 5 bilingual students were able to demonstrate the ability to read independently in Creole. That is, they don't need any help with prompts or anything like that. If you use the reading assessment, if they need instruction, if they're reading at an instructional level, it means the teacher has to be prompting and helping them over the mistakes they make. But if they're reading independently, by virtue of the scores that you take down for them as they read, it means that they're really good readers at that point. The students who showed the fastest progress in learning to read in English had the highest initial Creole reading accuracy scores. They progressed the fastest. And she says the use of Creole had no detrimental effects on the performance of the students in English. Their performance in the language areas were comparable. So, what are some conclusions we might draw for implementation? Now, I tried to limit that because I know many of our speakers were going to address this, and I'm agreeing with the need for careful planning as we go forward. So I think the results are promising, but we do need to do the research as we go forward. In other words, if we're going to determine whether the introduction of whatever approach we're using is successful, we need to be able to check how the students are performing. So I think it would be good to have what somebody else was suggesting, one of our speakers, to have a research group that will actually begin to look at the results. I think also we have to pay particular attention, as one of our other presenters said, to selecting the teachers, and they must have competence in the languages. The reason I'm saying this is because I did another study with student teachers at Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. And I was so happy to see that they all were enthusiastic about Creole. That was a big change from when I had done my first study. They wanted to see Creole being used. They liked the idea of Journée Creole and all that. But when I asked them whether they could speak English, speak French Creole, not one of them could. And they were admitting that that's something that they had to learn. So initially, I think as we implement, we have to use teachers who can speak French Creole and who are fluent in it and in English as well. It's important for heterogeneous classrooms, that is the ones that have children with the 3 backgrounds, English, French Creole, and the vernacular, to tailor the approaches to the needs of the children. And we can do that in various groupings, or we can organize our time schedule in such a way that we are paying attention to the child's home language, whether it is French Creole or the vernacular or English, and the approaches will be different because the objective then is going to be to make sure that the children learn to read and develop literacy in their home language, and then also the levels of literacy that they need in English to be successful in school. And finally, another set of considerations. I think we need to do a survey of teacher competence, and I'm very happy to see that our colleague at the FRC is already doing some excellent work on that, and that should help to inform the process that CAMDU is looking at right now. And I would think that if we want to be careful about implementation, if we begin to implement in the areas where we have high concentrations of French Creole speakers, and I know for a fact that there are areas in Roseau, in the cul-de-sac, and other areas like that where children still speak exclusive French Creole, we could begin to determine and use the approaches there with teachers who also speak Creole and English, really train them up, and then actually spread out from there once we know how this is working out to other areas. But that again would have to be in consideration with the broader language policy goals that are being set. So we also need to explore and experiment with the different instructional models that will promote bilingualism and biliteracy in the relevant languages. And books, I think, are already being written, and I ask the Governor General to comment on that. But we could consolidate efforts with groups producing age and grade appropriate instructional texts that are pleasing to the children, motivating them to read, and it's one of the things we would have to do. So I thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. This is a very rushed thing, but just the studies that we did, I was asked to focus on. And so I hope you get a sense of what we did. Merci. Ms. Coughlin?
Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup. Do we pass from you to Dame Paulette Louisie at this point?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Yes.
The audience is all yours.
Oh, okay. Well, bon après-midi tout le monde. Jodi a vraiment, c'est monter descendre, tout bagay ka fait. Pour moi là, c'est comme si ma ça même bien, jouer un souffle. Mais voilà. I just wanted to, I've been working with Professor McDonald for a long time. And so, most of what she has been, talking about things that we have discussed. So in the interest of time, I would just simply speak of the latest project that we are involved in. And that is the preparation of instructional material for the teaching of Creole to beginners. So from K to grade 3. And we've got a team headed by Professor Simmons, myself, and Ms. Marietta Edwards, who was the education officer instruction, now retired. So we've been working at it for a few years now. We've prepared, I think, at least 3 or 4 of the instructional, we prepared it, though they haven't been published. And so we are looking at, well, were it not for COVID, we probably would have reached much further along the way. And as Professor McDonald rightly pointed out, teacher training was key, because it's all well and good to say we must teach the language, in schools, but then if the teachers, don't speak the language properly, don't understand the mechanics of the language, it is like, like we say in our parlance, spinning top in mud. So as far as the national language policy is concerned, I just wanted to make the point that there have been so many attempts, several attempts to get the authorities, the government, the Ministry of Education to embrace this idea. Proposals have been submitted. Since, for example, 1980, when Dr. Lawrence Carrington was the feature speaker and the facilitator at the National Consultation on Education Conference. And he spoke of the social, the academic, and the psychological impact on people who are Creole speakers, but who are, forced to follow the educational, trajectory in English. And if just to quote him a bit, he was talking about what we are doing if we do not bring in the Creole into the consciousness of persons, that we are creating a linguistically insecure, inarticulate person who retreats the moment he feels that a particular issue requires a variety of language in which he is deficient. For he has been led to see his own language as having a place in his life that cannot be for the expression of real thought, and hence cannot be used for serious expression. And so withdrawal inevitably means no dialogue, and the child develops into an adult to whom someone must dictate what he must feel and do in a particular situation. And I think we are seeing that even now, 40 years later, in our society, that persons, they do hear the Creole, they do understand English, and but when you try to look at them and critical analysis, this is a deficiency. I think we probably have seen some light on the horizon, because the new administration has indicated its intention to give official language status to Creole. Now, this is a step further than any other administration has gone. So that is what I think the implementation of this policy. This is where we need to do the groundwork, so that by the time this gets onto government's priority list and its legislative agenda, we would have been, have gone some way towards providing, the foundation. I was Dr. Irvine's presentation. I mean, I agree with her when she says that persons know the writing system. I mean, some of them who do, but would insist that they use their own spelling. And this is, again, one of the reasons why we need an official sanction by government, by parliament, if one legislates it, that the writing system, which was established in the 1980s, 81, becomes the official system. So that, again, that would help do away with this individual approach that many persons have adopted to the Creole language, where they feel that, I mean, they speak Creole, they can write it anyhow, any way they feel like. So I mean, I know I was asked to make comments as a Creole advocate, and not necessarily as a researcher in that sense. So just with these few words, I'd like to compliment Ms. Kagling on this daunting task that she has undertaken, and I would like to thank all the presenters who, in fact, have given us, a clearer, even me anyway as well, a clearer path, a focus on how we start to implement not only the national, as Professor Devonish has said, the education language policy, but a national language policy. So with these few words, I would say thank you again for giving me that opportunity and to endorse the rest of the proceedings. And I look forward to hearing and listening the questions and the answers. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much, Dame Paulette Louise. One of the things I neglected to do was, as she correctly mentioned, introduce her, and not just as a Creole advocate, but as a researcher as well. She's one of as our other presenters who have published so much on Creole studies, holding positions on committees related to the Creole language, including at the Folk Research Center. So, and of course, if you look for the Creole dictionary online, you must see her name somewhere in there, right? So we know that as our Governor General, using Creole in all of those government positions at those events and so on, really walking the talk and not just talking the talk. And that's one of the things we are very, very grateful for. We thank you so much for all of the work that you have contributed, as have some others here in St. Lucia. And the fact that you are still here plodding along with us on work on Creole. And I must say, lending her expertise to the work that we're doing here. It is a daunting task, but I think that every one of us who come along, we will make some contribution. Some of those will last decades, like Dame Paulette Louise's. Some may last a few years, but we do appreciate all of the contributions made so far. And I want to say thank you to all of our presenters. I think this was a wonderful opportunity because we got different perspectives. I think we have almost a 360 view of what it is we're really trying to handle. And we do have some decisions to make, but I think overall, some of the things that really pop out to us is that this is not a one-man job or one-woman job, as you may have it. It is going to require the support and the resources of our entire government to be able to get this done. We, as I said, have some decisions to make, especially regarding teacher training. I noticed a repeated focus on those things, teacher training and research, right? The research that has been done and the research that must continue, as Professor Hazel Simmons McDonald mentioned, on a greater scale to ensure that those very practical suggestions and strategies and the evidence that we have already can be expanded, can be scaled so that we can see, yes, these are things that will go into our curricula. At this point, we are past our time. We are 13 minutes past our time. And I would have really loved for us to have a half-hour discussion. What I will have to do is ask you to put any questions that you have in the chat. I will share those with our panelists and they will make contributions to those responses. And as we're sending out our recordings, we're sending out the presentations, we will also send out the answers to your questions, both those that are in the chat on Zoom, as well as any that may be on YouTube. I noticed that there was one posted in the comments on YouTube. We will not miss that either. But before we close, we do have our Chief Education Officer, Dr. Fiona Meyer, who is here with us to just say a few words. So from that Ministry of Education official perspective, just have us say a few words on what we have experienced here today. So over to you, Dr. Meyer.
Thank you, Ms. Caglin. Permit me to recognize Dame Paulette. Always such a pleasure to have you, Dame. All of the presenters here, our educators, our colleagues, well-wishers. I also saw Monsignor Patrick Anthony in the group. It's really a privilege to know that people are watching on YouTube, they're watching via Zoom and other platforms. So on behalf of the Department of Education, Innovation, and Gender Relations, what was formerly now includes vocational training, we just want to say thank you. We want to say thank you. We know that this has been a task, a long serving, so much energy has gone into this. And if you know Miss Kathleen, you know she's got the energy. But finding such competent, accomplished presenters from all over the Caribbean, we know that Miss Kathleen and the team at CAMDU, you've worked tirelessly to make that happen. So let us say thank you first and foremost to you. The presence of our various colleagues is testimony to the fact that we appreciate that our language, Creole, is part of who we are. And it is so very important that we continue to embrace it and to formalize it. When I heard them speaking about 40 years on, the struggle, maybe it's time that we really look at very concrete next steps, knowing that we have the backing of competent individuals who continue to be supportive of incoming individuals such as Ms. Kaglin and the team. I was so pleased to hear of the Martinique experiences with over 700 qualified and certified Creole teachers. This is really amazing to see. And all of the presentations, we've seen best practice across the region. It is really, really important that we recognize that our children can be and should be bilingual. It is not about one language over another for us. It's about recognizing that both of these languages and other languages can coexist. So I really want to say thank you. Je l'occasion pour juste dire merci tout le monde qui participait, tout le monde qui présentait au soir après-midi. Nous assises nous joignent quantité information. Sorti c'est nous qui aux famille nous qui en Haïti, famille nous qui en Martinique, famille nous qui en Saint-Lucie, parce que nous tous ensemble, le gage créole la camouche nous ni même bagaille là ensemble, nous ni même bagaille la vie nous avec les nous garder manière nous ka parler ça ka passer qualité moun nou yé comment nous ka vivre la vie. So nous voulons apprendre from experience. C'est famille nous Martinique, famille nous Guadeloupe, famille nous qui est Haïti, pour nous aussi aider ce moment nous pour yon ni plus joyeux les yo sortent de l'école parce que yo ka savent parole yo ka parler à langage yo ka parler aussi c'est un langage qui ni valait. Creole là c'est pas simplement pour nous faire blague pour nous jouer puis mais c'est un langage qui ni valait et que nous ça joindre ce moment nous pour venir assister yo pour venir primaire. Yo ça marcher Creole là, yo ça parler pour tout ça nous qu'a fait. Au soir après-midi, nous très contents d'être avec nous pour ces familles Martinique nous qui pas connaître tellement, mais ici madame, c'est Governor General Saint-Lucie avec c'était madame dame qui était toujours qu'à parler Creole. Il parlait Creole dans le parlement. C'est quelle importance. So we really, really appreciate you for taking part. Dear colleagues, I know you've been on in the various media, via YouTube, via Zoom. It is to keep the conversation happening. And for me, it's not only about conversation, it's really about concrete next steps. I could almost want to take the Martinique model and transport it into the St. Lucian system and to really see how well we can support our children. I also want to take the Martinique resources as well with us. But we know that our partners in Martinique have always been part of training for our teachers. I can say to you that every one of the presenters spoke to issues that are very, very close to my heart. And we really, really hope that our next concrete steps can look to the competence that we have in St. Lucia in the region to push this project, to push this initiative, to push this way forward in a very concrete manner. Moi, vle di, comme fini, merci tout le monde. nous tenons un chai bon parole, mais nous pas aussi regarder que seulement belle parole, nous assises, nous écouter, mais nous voulons garder de manière, nous essayer de travailler ensemble pour, il n'y a pas l'autre 40 l'année pour passer, mais nous ça dit, en l'autre 2 l'année, en l'autre 3 l'année, là nous commencer, yon pied après l'autre, nous essayer pour travailler ensemble pour nous faire ça en réalité. So thank you very much again, everybody. Thank you for having me. Miss Caglin, hats off to you. Hats off to the Camdo team. I know that you all have worked tirelessly and we sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much to everyone who stayed on, as I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maya. Thank you very much for those words. And as Dr. Maya has indicated, we want to move from the decades of conversations and plans to actually bringing this to action. And I think today has shown us we have more than enough to move to that step. So what are our immediate next steps? Professor Hazel Simmons mentioned that we need to know what teachers actually know. What are the competencies? What are their needs? We do actually have someone, we have Laura Lord. She is putting together a survey specifically for teachers to find out what are their competencies, what are their concerns, what they believe should be happening with the Creole language. So we will be on the lookout for that to share with our teachers. In addition, we want to move from this step. We will be collecting together all of the presentations from this conference. As I mentioned, any questions that you may have, we will be getting the answers to those and putting together other documents that have come to us from Haiti as well, additional documents that we will have gotten from Martinique, so that we can have a compilation of materials that we can use as a starting point. By January 2022, we would have written out that final plan, appended to what we have as our draft policy, and present that so that our Ministry of Education can present that to our government in cabinet. And from there, we will have the opportunity to begin actual implementation and not just talking about implementation. There are so many persons to thank this afternoon, in addition to our very esteemed, very well experienced presenters from Jamaica, from Martinique, from Haiti, from St. Lucia, those who are in St. Lucia and those who are living abroad. Thank you so much for answering the call. I'm going through the meetings, the back and forths, and reading all of my emails, my many emails. Thank you very much for being here with us today and presenting so clearly on what it is we need to do to implement our language policy. And of course, we want to thank all of those persons who may now seem nameless, but who have worked tirelessly in the last few decades to prepare all of those documents, the research, the plans that have informed where we are today. Thank you to all of our attendees. Thank you for your patience with us and for remaining an extra 22 minutes on our conference. Have a good day, everyone, and look forward to hearing a little bit from me again. Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Au revoir. Thank you very much for being here.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Passez un bel après-midi. Bien, merci. En pile, en pile. Ça a été intéressant, tout bonnement.
Oui.
Une belle petite journée tout le monde.
Merci. Bonne journée tout le monde. Hello, Mosi.
À tantôt, tantôt. À tantôt, tantôt, parce qu'il y a fait.
Okay. Good, man.